Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Red River Gorge in Kentucky's Daniel Boone National Forest, where the ancient sandstone cliffs cast shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. The four of us had been planning this camping trip for months. Jennifer Davis, my college roommate's sister, had just gotten out of a messy divorce and needed to get away from civilization for a while. Robert Johnson, my coworker from the accounting firm, was dealing with his own demons after his father's sudden death. Sarah Rodriguez, Jennifer's best friend since high school, came along because she worried about leaving Jen alone in her current state. And me? I suppose I was running from the suffocating predictability of my cubicle existence, desperate for something real and raw. We'd chosen the most isolated section of the Red River Gorge we could find on the maps, an area called Devil's Hollow, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. The name should have been our first warning, but we were city dwellers drunk on the romance of wilderness adventure. We had no idea that some places earned their names through blood and terror. The drive took us deeper into Kentucky's wilderness than any of us had ever been. Cell towers became sparse, then non-existent. The GPS signal flickered and died somewhere around the town of Slade, leaving us dependent on an old paper map Robert had picked up at a gas station. The road narrowed to barely more than a trail, branches scraping against Jennifer's Honda CR-V like skeletal fingers trying to pull us back. "Are you sure this is right?" Sarah asked from the passenger seat, her voice tight with nervousness. She'd been checking her phone obsessively for the past hour, watching the signal bars dwindle to nothing. "The map says Devil's Hollow is just another few miles," Robert said from behind me, studying the creased paper with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient text. "There should be a primitive camping area near Widow's Creek." Jennifer, who'd been unusually quiet during the drive, suddenly spoke up. "My ex-husband used to say that some places don't want to be found." Her voice carried a hollow quality that made my skin prickle. He said the land itself can be hungry. We all fell silent after that. The forest pressed closer around us, the canopy so thick that although it was only 4 in the afternoon, the light had taken on the murky quality of twilight. Ancient oaks and maples twisted together overhead, their branches forming a ceiling that seemed to pulse with its own dark life. When we finally reached the camping area, it was nothing like the pictures on the website. Instead of the maintained primitive campground we'd expected, we found a small clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to lean inward like curious giants. A weather-beaten sign reading "Devil's Hollow, Camp at Own Risk" hung at an angle from a rotting post. Someone had carved additional words below the official text, but time and weather had made them illegible. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah whispered as we unloaded our gear. The silence of the forest was oppressive. No bird songs, no insect buzz, just the whisper of wind through leaves that sounded uncomfortably like distant voices. Robert laughed, but it came out forced and brittle. "Come on, it's just woods. We're not characters in some horror movie." But I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder as he spoke, as if expecting something to emerge from the tree line. We set up our tents in a rough circle around where we planned to build our fire pit. The work went quickly. We were all experienced campers despite our urban day jobs, but as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice small things that set my nerves on edge. The trees around our campsite all seemed to bear old scars, long gouges in their bark that looked like claw marks from some massive animal. When I mentioned this to Robert, he examined them closely and shook his head. "Probably just bear marking territory," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. More disturbing was the complete absence of wildlife. In all my camping experiences, I'd never been in a forest so utterly devoid of animal sounds. No squirrels chittering in the branches, No birds calling to their mates, not even the buzz of mosquitoes. It was as if every living creature had fled this place, leaving only the trees to bear witness to whatever haunted Devil's Hollow. As evening approached, we gathered deadwood for our fire. The branches we collected felt strangely cold to the touch, even those lying in patches of sunlight. When Robert tried to light the kindling, the flames kept guttering out despite the still air. It took nearly a dozen attempts to get a stable fire going, and even then, the flames burned with an odd blue-green tinge that cast sickly shadows on our faces. "Must be some kind of mineral in the wood," Jennifer said, but she moved her sleeping bag further from the fire pit. We all did. The unnatural flames seemed to whisper as they danced, and more than once I could have sworn I heard my name in the crackling of burning wood. Dinner was a subdued affair. The canned chili that had seemed so appealing back in civilization now tasted like ash in my mouth. Sarah complained that her water bottle had developed a metallic taste, and Robert couldn't finish his meal at all, claiming his stomach was upset. Only Jennifer seemed unaffected, eating mechanically while staring into the writhing flames. "I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to tell me," she said suddenly, her voice distant. "She grew up in these mountains, back when families lived off the land. She said there were places where the earth itself was sick, where something ancient and hungry slept in the deep woods." "Jen, you're starting to freak us out," Sarah said with a nervous laugh, but Jennifer continued as if she hadn't heard. "She said that when people went missing in those places, sometimes they'd come back, but they wouldn't really be people anymore. They'd be hollow, hungry, wearing familiar faces like masks. A log in the fire popped loudly, sending up a shower of sparks that looked disturbingly like tiny screaming faces. We all jumped, then laughed awkwardly at our own reactions. "Okay, enough ghost stories," Robert said, standing and brushing off his jeans. "I'm going to gather some more firewood before it gets too dark. We'll need enough to last the night." "Don't go alone," Sarah said quickly. "Michael, go with him." But Robert was already walking toward the tree line, flashlight in hand. "I'll be fine. Just going to grab some of those fallen branches we saw on the way in. Be back in 15 minutes. That was the last time we saw the real Robert Johnson. The 15 minutes stretched to 30, then 45. Sarah paced around the fire pit, checking her watch every few seconds. Jennifer sat motionless, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't read. The fire had returned to normal orange and yellow, but the warmth it provided felt superficial, unable to penetrate the growing chill in my bones. "He should be back by now," Sarah said for the dozenth time. "Something's wrong." I was about to suggest we go look for him when we heard the sound of footsteps in the darkness beyond our camp. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through fallen leaves. Too slow, I realized with a growing sense of unease. Too measured, like someone concentrating intensely on the simple act of walking. "Robert," I called out. "That you, man?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then Robert's voice drifted out of the darkness, but it sounded wrong somehow. Flat and emotionless, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. "Yes," he said simply. "It's me." He stepped into the circle of firelight, and at first glance everything seemed normal. Same rumpled hiking clothes, same messy brown hair, same wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to notice the details that made my stomach clench with primitive terror. Robert's skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, as if he were a poorly made mannequin. His eyes, which had always been a warm brown, now appeared completely black in the firelight, not dark brown, but utterly void of color or reflection. When he smiled at our worried questions, his lips pulled back too far, revealing teeth that seemed somehow too sharp, too numerous. "Where have you been?" Sarah demanded. "We were worried sick." Robert's head turned toward her with mechanical precision, like a doll's head clicking into position. "Gathering wood," he said in that same flat tone. But his hands were empty, and there were dark stains on his clothes that hadn't been there before. "Where's the firewood?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Robert looked down at his empty hands with apparent surprise, as if he'd forgotten what he was supposed to be carrying. "I ate it," he said, then laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made us all flinch. Jennifer stood up slowly, her face pale in the firelight. "Robert, are you feeling okay? You look different." "Different how?" Robert's voice carried no curiosity, no emotion at all, his black eyes fixed on Jennifer with predatory intensity. "I feel wonderful. Hungry, but wonderful." That's when I noticed that Robert wasn't breathing. His chest remained perfectly still, and in the cold night air there was no mist from his exhalations. The thing wearing Robert's face was as still as a corpse, animated only by something that had no need for breath or heartbeat. "I think we should go," Sarah whispered, backing toward her tent. "I think we should pack up right now and leave." The Robert thing's head swiveled toward her with that same unnatural precision. "But we just got here," it said, and when it smiled this time, I could see that its teeth were stained with something dark. "I was hoping we could all get better acquainted." I'd been in my share of frightening situations before, muggings in the city, a car accident on the interstate, even a house fire in college. But this was different. This was terror on a level that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive hindbrain that recognized predators and death. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like water. Jennifer, however, seemed oddly calm. She walked over to Robert, studying his face with clinical detachment. "You're not Robert anymore, are you?" she said matter-of-factly. The thing tilted its head, considering her question. "I am Robert," it said finally. "I remember being Robert. I remember his life, his thoughts, his fears. But I am also more than Robert now. Hungrier than Robert ever was." "What happened to him?" Jennifer asked. "What happened to our friend?" "He fed me," the creature said, and its voice carried a note of genuine satisfaction. "He wandered too far from your little circle of light, and he fed me. Now he feeds through me. Now I am strong enough to feed properly." Sarah made a small choked sound and stumbled backward. Her foot caught on a tent rope, and she fell hard, landing just inches from the fire pit. The flames flared higher as if feeding on her fear, casting wild shadows that danced across Robert's increasingly inhuman features. That's when I saw what had happened to his hands. The fingernails had grown into curved claws, stained with what looked like dirt but which I knew was something far worse. His hiking boots bulged strangely, as if his feet had changed shape inside them. When he opened his mouth to speak, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth extending back into a throat that seemed to go down much deeper than any human throat should. "What are you?" I managed to whisper. The creature that had been Robert Johnson smiled its terrible smile. "I am hunger," it said. "I am the hollow spaces between the trees, the darkness that swallows light. I am what waits in places like this for fools who venture too far from the safety of their concrete and steel." Jennifer nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "A Wendigo," she said softly. "My grandmother's stories were true." "Your grandmother was wise," the creature agreed. "She knew to fear the hungry places, the spots where the boundary between worlds grows thin. This hollow has been feeding for centuries, growing stronger with each offering." I couldn't understand why Jennifer was so calm, why she wasn't running or screaming like every fiber of my being demanded. She just stood there, facing down a nightmare that wore our friend's face as if they were discussing the weather. "Jennifer, we need to go," I said urgently. "Right now." But she shook her head. "There's nowhere to run to, Michael. We're miles from the road and it's dark. In the dark, it has all the advantages." The Wendigo laughed, that same glass-breaking sound. "Listen to her, Michael. She understands. Running only makes the hunt more exciting." Sarah had managed to get back to her feet, and now she was backing away from the fire toward the edge of our campsite. "This isn't real," she kept muttering. "This can't be real." The creature's head snapped toward her with impossible speed. "Oh, but it is real, Sarah. As real as the taste of marrow and the sound of breaking bones. As real as the fear I can smell pouring off you like sweat." I realized with horror that I could smell it too, a sharp, acrid odor that reminded me of a zoo's big cat exhibit, the smell of a predator's cage. "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "What I have always wanted," the Wendigo said. "To feed, to grow stronger, to add your voices to the choir that sings in the darkness." It gestured toward the trees surrounding us, and for the first time, I noticed the shapes hanging from the high branches. Not leaves or Spanish moss, but something else entirely. Something that moved slightly in the windless air. "How many?" Jennifer asked quietly. "Dozens," the creature replied with obvious pride. "Hikers, campers, hunters who thought they knew these woods, all of them feeding me now, all of them part of the Hollow's hunger." Sarah had reached the tree line and she spun around to run into the forest. But the Wendigo moved faster than anything human-shaped should be able to move. One moment it was standing by the fire, the next it was directly in front of her, blocking her escape route. "Where are you going, Sarah?" it asked with mock concern. "The real fun hasn't even started yet," Sarah screamed. A high, piercing sound that should have echoed through the forest but was swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. The Wendigo reached out with one clawed hand and touched her face almost gently. "Shh," it whispered. "Fear spoils the meat." That's when Jennifer acted. While the creature was focused on Sarah, she grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the Wendigo's head. The flames connected with its face, and the thing let out a shriek that sounded like a dozen voices screaming in harmony. "Run!" Jennifer shouted. "It doesn't like fire." But even as she spoke, I could see that the burns on the creature's face were already healing, the charred flesh knitting itself back together with nauseating speed. The Wendigo turned toward Jennifer with murder in its black eyes. "Clever," it hissed. "But fire only slows us down. It doesn't stop us." I grabbed another burning branch and moved to stand beside Jennifer. Sarah, freed from the creature's hypnotic gaze, scrambled back toward our camp. For a moment, the three of us stood in a rough line, holding our makeshift torches against the darkness that seemed to be pressing closer from all sides. The Wendigo studied us with predatory patience. "You cannot fight what you do not understand," it said. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive. I am the hunger that sleeps in the bones of the earth itself." "Then why are you afraid of the fire?" Jennifer demanded. The creature's laugh was bitter now, edged with pain. "Because fire burns away illusion. Fire reveals truth. And the truth is that I was once human, just like your friend Robert, just like you will be when the change takes hold." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What change?" "Did you think my touch leaves no mark?" the Wendigo asked. "Did you think you could breathe the air of this place, drink its water without consequence? You have been here for hours now. The Hollow's hunger is already growing in your blood." I looked down at my hands, and with growing horror, I saw that my fingernails had grown longer, harder. When I ran my tongue across my teeth, they felt sharper than before. Sarah made a strangled sound, and I saw that her eyes were beginning to take on that same black, reflective quality. Only Jennifer seemed unchanged, and now I understood why she'd been so calm. "You knew," I said. "You knew what this place was." She nodded sadly. "My grandmother told me the signs, the symptoms. She told me how to recognize the hungry places. I've been watching all of you change since we arrived." "Then why did you bring us here?" Sarah's voice was becoming rougher, more guttural. "Because I'm dying," Jennifer said simply. "Cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave me 3 months, maybe less, and I couldn't bear the thought of wasting away in some sterile hospital room." The Wendigo clapped its hands in delight. "How wonderful! A willing sacrifice. It has been so long since someone came to us freely." "I'm not sacrificing myself to you," Jennifer said firmly. "I'm sacrificing myself for them." She turned to Sarah and me, her eyes bright with tears. "The change isn't complete yet. There's still time for you to fight it if you're strong enough, but only if I give you a reason to fight." Before any of us could react, Jennifer thrust her burning branch deep into the chest of the Wendigo. The creature screamed and staggered backward, but Jennifer followed, driving the flame deeper. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, along with something else, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach heave. "The heart!" Jennifer shouted as she wrestled with the burning creature. "You have to destroy its heart." I understood. The Wendigo might be supernatural, but it was wearing Robert's body, and Robert's body still had vulnerabilities. Sarah and I rushed forward with our own torches, but the creature was fighting back now, its claws raking deep gouges in Jennifer's arms and chest. The battle was brief but savage. The Wendigo was incredibly strong, but the fire was its weakness, and there were 3 of us. We pressed our attack, driving the flames into its body again and again, until finally it collapsed to the ground, convulsing as the fire consumed it from within. But Jennifer had paid a terrible price. The Wendigo's claws had opened her throat, and blood was pulsing out with each heartbeat. She looked up at us with eyes that were already growing distant. "The car keys," she whispered, "in my pocket." Sarah was crying openly now, cradling Jennifer's head in her lap. I could see that the black tinge was fading from her eyes as the Wendigo died, but the grief was replacing the supernatural terror with something just as devastating. "We need to get out of here," I said, though the words felt like ash in my mouth, "before more of them come." We left Jennifer there beside the burning remains of the creature that had killed her. It felt wrong, abandoning her body in that cursed place, but we had no choice. The fire was spreading to the dry undergrowth, and in the distance I could hear sounds that might have been wind but which sounded uncomfortably like voices calling our names. The drive out of Devil's Hollow was a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. The dirt road seemed to shift and change in our headlights, leading us in circles through increasingly alien landscape. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that we finally found our way back to the main highway. We never reported what happened. How could we? Who would believe a story about Wendigos and ancient hunger in the Kentucky wilderness? Instead, we told the authorities that Jennifer had fallen from a cliff while hiking alone, and that we'd been unable to recover her body. They accepted our story with the weary resignation of people who'd heard similar tales too many times. But the real horror didn't end with our escape from Devil's Hollow. The changes the Wendigo had spoken of were still working in our blood, just dormant now without the creature's influence to feed them. I can feel them sometimes, especially at night when I'm alone. A gnawing hunger that no amount of food can satisfy. A restlessness that drives me to walk the streets until dawn, looking for something I can't name. Sarah feels it too. We've talked about it, carefully, obliquely, never saying exactly what we mean. She's started volunteering at a homeless shelter, throwing herself into helping others with an intensity that borders on desperation. I think she's trying to feed the hunger with kindness instead of flesh. So far, it's working. As for me, I've been researching, reading everything I can find about Wendigos, about places like Devil's Hollow, about the old stories that our ancestors told to warn their children about the dark spaces between the trees. I've learned that Jennifer's grandmother was part of a long tradition of knowledge, passed down through generations of mountain folk who understood that some hungers never truly die. The official records show that Devil's Hollow was closed to camping indefinitely after a series of wildlife incidents. But I know the truth. The fire we started didn't destroy the place, only wounded it. The hunger that sleeps in those woods is patient, and it's waiting for new visitors to wander too far from the light. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the wind carries strange scents, I dream about Robert. Not the creature that wore his face, but the real Robert, trapped somewhere in the hollow's embrace watching through black eyes as his body committed horrors he could never have imagined. In these dreams, he's still conscious, still aware, screaming silently as the Wendigo puppets his flesh. I wake from these dreams with the taste of raw meat in my mouth and dirt under my fingernails that I don't remember digging. The hunger grows stronger each time, and I know that eventually, Sarah and I will have to make a choice. We can surrender to the change, embrace the thing we're becoming, and return to feed the Hollow's appetite. Or we can find another way to quiet the gnawing need that grows in our bellies like a cancer. Jennifer showed us a third option, there at the end, a sacrifice that saved us without feeding the darkness. But I don't know if I have her courage, her willingness to trade my life for someone else's salvation. All I know is that Devil's Hollow is still out there, still hungry, still waiting, and somewhere in the deepest part of my soul, a voice that sounds like Robert whispers that it would be so easy to drive back into those woods, to let the change complete itself, to stop fighting the hunger that grows stronger with each passing day. The maps still show Devil's Hollow, though they mark it as closed. But maps lie, especially in places where the boundary between worlds grows thin. The Hollow will open again when it needs to feed, and when it does, someone will find the road that leads into the trees. Someone will ignore the warnings, dismiss the old stories, and venture into the darkness with nothing but artificial light to protect them. I've considered going back, not to feed but to warn others away, to stand guard at the entrance to that cursed place and turn people back before they can make the same mistake we did. But I know that would be suicide. The hunger in my blood calls to the hunger in those woods, and if I got too close, I might not be able to resist the call. So instead, I tell this story. I write it down and hope that someone, somewhere, will read it and understand. That when they see the signs, the roads that appear on no official maps, the places where wildlife goes silent, the woods that seem to lean in too close, they'll remember Jennifer's sacrifice and turn back. Because some hungers are older than humanity, and they're always ready to welcome new flesh into their embrace. The Wendigo may be gone, but the Hollow remains, patient and eternal, waiting for the next group of fools to venture too far from the light. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I can still hear it calling my name. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest, deep in the Red River Gorge area of eastern Kentucky, where the ancient sandstone cliffs hold secrets that should never be disturbed. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my college buddies, the kind of weekend escape we'd been planning since graduation 5 years ago, but never seemed to manage until now. Jake Morrison, my roommate from sophomore year, had suggested we finally make good on our promise to explore the wilderness. "Come on, Mike," he'd said over beers that Friday night in Louisville. "When's the next time all 4 of us will be free? Steve's getting married in 6 months, and you know Marcus will be buried in that promotion at the firm." Steve Hendricks had driven down from Cincinnati, his beat-up Jeep Cherokee loaded with enough gear for a week-long expedition despite our modest plans. Marcus Rodriguez flew in from Chicago, looking pale and stressed from another 60-hour work week at his consulting job. We'd all changed since college, the easy camaraderie replaced by the careful politeness of adults who'd grown apart but refused to admit it. The plan was straightforward. Hike into Chimney Top Rock area, set up camp near one of the primitive sites, spend Saturday exploring the gorge system, and drive home Sunday evening. Simple. Clean. A chance to pretend we were still 22 and the world was full of possibilities instead of mortgage payments and performance reviews. We parked at the Chimney Top Rock trailhead on Friday afternoon, the October air crisp with the promise of a cold night. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, brilliant reds and golds that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. Steve shouldered his massive pack with a grunt, already sweating despite the cool temperature. "Jesus, Steve, what'd you pack in there?" Marcus asked, adjusting his own lightweight day pack. Even on vacation, Marcus looked like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. Expensive hiking boots that had never seen dirt, synthetic fabrics that wicked moisture and promised to keep him comfortable in any weather. "Just the essentials," Steve replied. but his grin suggested otherwise. Steve had always been the one to overpack, to bring 3 solutions for every problem that might arise. In college, his dorm room had looked like a survival shop, complete with first aid kit, multi-tool, and enough granola bars to feed a small army. Jake led the way, consulting his GPS unit and paper topographic map with the practiced ease of someone who actually knew what he was doing. Of the 4 of us, Jake was the only one who'd kept up with outdoor activities after graduation. He worked as a park ranger in Tennessee now, all lean muscle and easy confidence in the wilderness. The rest of us were weekend warriors at best. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest, the canopy so thick that even in late afternoon, the light had a greenish underwater quality. Our footsteps were muffled by layers of fallen leaves, creating an oddly intimate atmosphere where our breathing and the occasional snap of a twig seemed unnaturally loud. "Remember that camping trip junior year?" Steve asked as we climbed a particularly steep section. "When you forgot to pack your sleeping bag and had to share with Marcus?" "I didn't forget," I protested, the memory making me smile despite my growing fatigue. "You told me you had an extra." "I lied," Steve admitted cheerfully. "Wanted to see if you'd actually go through with the trip." "And you were fine sharing," Marcus added, "until you found out I talk in my sleep." "Talk?" Jake called back from ahead. "You conducted entire business presentations. I thought you were having a breakdown." We all laughed, the sound echoing off the trees in a way that felt both comforting and slightly wrong. There was something about the acoustics in this part of the forest. Sounds carried differently, lingered longer than they should have. The laughter died as we rounded a bend and saw our destination. Chimney Top Rock jutted from the forest like a broken tooth, its sandstone face scarred and weathered. But it wasn't the rock formation that made us pause. It was the silence. The forest had gone completely quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no wind in the trees. Just our own breathing and the faint sound of our gear creaking. "Weird," Jake murmured, checking his GPS. "We should be hearing Gladdy Creek from here." We stood there for a long moment, 4 grown men suddenly feeling very small in the vast wilderness. Then a blue jay called from somewhere ahead, breaking the spell, and we heard the distant gurgle of water over stone. "Probably just a dead zone for wildlife," Marcus said, but his voice carried a forced lightness. "Happens all the time in nature." We hiked the final quarter-mile to our intended campsite, a relatively flat area about 50 yards from the creek. Jake had scouted the location online, and it looked perfect. Close enough to water for convenience, far enough to avoid flooding, with established fire rings from previous campers. What we found instead was wrong in a way that was hard to define. The fire rings were there, but they formed an almost perfect circle, 7 of them, each exactly the same distance from the center of the clearing. Someone had arranged stones around each ring in intricate patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at for too long. In the center of the 7 fire rings, a larger circle of white stones had been carefully placed, and within that circle, the ground was completely bare. Not just free of grass and leaves, but scraped down to raw earth that looked scorched despite the lack of any recent fire. "What the hell is this?" Steve dropped his pack with a thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Jake walked the perimeter of the clearing, his expression troubled. "This isn't on any of the Forest Service maps. Primitive campsites aren't supposed to be ceremonial." "Maybe it's some kind of Native American site," Marcus suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wrong area," Jake replied. "The Cherokee didn't really settle this part of Kentucky, and this..." He gestured at the stone patterns. "This isn't Cherokee." I knelt beside one of the fire rings, studying the arrangement of stones around its perimeter. The pattern was hypnotic, drawing the eye inward in a spiral that seemed to keep going deeper than the physical stones should allow. There was something carved into several of the rocks. Not symbols exactly, more like deliberate gouges that formed no recognizable pattern but somehow suggested meaning. "We should find another spot," I said, standing up quickly. The carved marks had made my vision blur in a way that reminded me of staring at optical illusions too long. "Come on, guys," Steve protested. "It's just rocks. Some hippies probably had a ceremony here or something. Besides, it's getting dark, and this is the only decent flat ground for miles." He was right about the time. The sun was already below the tree line, and the temperature was dropping fast. The nearest alternative campsite Jake had marked was another 2 miles deeper into the gorge, and none of us wanted to be setting up camp in complete darkness. We made our decision through mutual reluctance rather than enthusiasm. Jake insisted we camp outside the stone circles, setting up our tents in a rough line about 20 yards away from the clearing. Steve grumbled about wasted preparation but helped gather firewood. Marcus contributed by documenting everything with his phone camera, though he kept having to retake photos because they came out blurry or inexplicably dark. "Probably just the lighting," he muttered, examining another failed shot of the stone patterns. "Or maybe the camera's acting up." He called, by the time we had our tents set up and a proper fire going in one of the existing rings, full darkness had settled over the forest. The fire cast dancing shadows that made the other stone circles look like hungry mouths, and more than once I caught myself staring at them, expecting to see movement in their dark centers. Steve had indeed overpacked, producing a bottle of bourbon and a feast of camping food that put our simple provisions to shame. We ate well and drank enough to restore some of our college-era camaraderie. The bourbon helped blur the edges of our unease, and soon we were trading stories and jokes like the years hadn't changed us at all. "Remember Professor Hendricks?" Marcus asked, taking another pull from the bottle. "The one who swore that geology final was going to be easy?" "Yeah, right before he gave us a test on rock formations we'd never covered," I replied. "I still have nightmares about limestone versus sandstone identification." "Speaking of nightmares," Steve said, his voice taking on the theatrical tone he used for ghost stories, "you guys know this area has some seriously messed up folklore, right?" Jake looked up from poking the fire. "What kind of folklore?" "I did some research before we came out here," Steve continued, clearly pleased to have captured our attention. "This whole region has stories going back centuries. Native American legends about creatures that hunt in the deep woods, settlers who went missing and came back. Different." "Different how?" I asked, despite myself. "Wrong. Like something else was wearing their skin. There are stories about entire families who just vanished from their homesteads, leaving behind all their possessions but no trace of where they went. And the ones who did come back..." Steve's voice dropped to a whisper. "Their own families didn't recognize them. Said they moved wrong, talked wrong, like they'd forgotten how to be human." "That's just frontier paranoia," Marcus said dismissively. "Isolated communities, harsh living conditions, probably mental illness and accidents they couldn't explain." "Maybe," Steve agreed, "but the stories didn't stop with the settlers. Rangers and hikers have been reporting weird shit in these woods for decades. People going missing for days and coming back with no memory of where they'd been. Campers finding their camps destroyed while they slept, but not by animals. Wrong sounds coming from the forest at night." "What kind of wrong sounds?" I asked. Steve grinned in the firelight. "Human voices, but speaking backwards. Laughter that comes from underneath the ground. And sometimes..." He paused for dramatic effect. "Sometimes campers report hearing their own voices calling to them from the darkness, trying to lure them away from their fires. A log shifted in our fire, sending up a shower of sparks and momentarily brightening the clearing. In that brief flare of light, I could have sworn I saw something move in one of the other stone circles. A quick, furtive motion like someone ducking down. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, pointing toward the far side of the clearing. They all looked, but the fire had settled back to its normal glow, and the circles were lost in shadow again. "See what?" Jake asked. "I thought I saw..." "Never mind. Probably just a trick of the light." But Marcus was studying the darkness with a troubled expression. "You know, I've been feeling like we're being watched ever since we got here. Probably just the isolation getting to me." "It's the forest," Jake said quietly. "Happens to everyone their first time deep in the woods. Your brain isn't used to processing so much natural stimuli. so it starts seeing patterns that aren't there. As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted through the trees, distant but unmistakably human. A voice calling something in a language I didn't recognize, the words carrying clearly on the still air. We all froze, listening. The voice came again, closer this time, and I felt ice form in my stomach as I realized what it sounded like. It sounded like one of us. "That's not possible," Marcus whispered. The voice called a third time, and now there was no mistaking it. It was Jake's voice, but wrong somehow. The inflection off, the tone too flat, like someone doing a poor impression of him. "That's not me," Jake said unnecessarily, his hand moving instinctively to the knife on his belt. "Could be another camper," Steve suggested, but his voice shook slightly. "Maybe someone's lost and calling for help." With my voice, Jake stood up, peering into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. "That's not how being lost works." The voice came again, definitely closer, and this time it was calling Marcus's name in that same wrong Jake inflection. "Marcus, Marcus, come here." "Okay, that's fucked up," Marcus said, scooting closer to the fire. "That's really fucked up." We sat in tense silence, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour, but the voice didn't return. Eventually, the bourbon and exhaustion overcame our unease, and we began making noises about getting some sleep. "Someone should keep watch," I suggested. "This isn't a war zone, Mike," Steve said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. "We're just spooked by some weird acoustics and too much ghost story bullshit." In the end, we compromised. Jake volunteered to take first watch, staying up until midnight, then waking Marcus for the second shift. Steve and I would split the remaining hours until dawn. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the others settling into their tents. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting barely enough light to see the clearing. From my position, I had a clear view through my tent's mesh window of the stone circles, now just dark shapes against the darker forest. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound, the settling of cooling rocks, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through leaves, made me tense. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into uneasy dreams. I woke to Marcus shaking my tent. "Mike, wake up! Something's wrong!" I struggled out of my sleeping bag, immediately aware that something was different. The forest was too quiet again, and our fire had gone completely out despite Jake banking it carefully before his watch ended. "What time is it?" I asked, checking my watch. 3:30 in the morning. "That's just it," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "I don't know. My watch stopped at 1:47 and my phone's completely dead. Not low battery. Dead, like the circuit board fried." I checked my own phone. Black screen, no response to the power button. My watch was still running, but it showed 3:30, which meant either Marcus's watch was wrong or time had jumped forward an hour and 43 minutes without my noticing. "Where's Jake?" "That's what I was hoping you'd know. His tent's empty, sleeping bag's still warm, but he's gone." We woke Steve, who confirmed that his electronics were also dead. His watch had stopped at 2:15, but he couldn't remember what time it had been when Jake woke him for his shift. "Maybe he just went to take a piss," Steve suggested, but his eyes kept darting to the stone circles. "For over an hour, without telling anyone?" Marcus was trying to keep his voice steady, but fear was bleeding through. And why are all our electronics dead? We searched the immediate area with flashlights, calling Jake's name in harsh whispers that seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. No response, no sign of struggle, no indication of which direction he might have gone. It was Steve who noticed the footprints. "Guys, look at this." He was crouched beside the largest stone circle, the one in the center of the clearing. His flashlight beam illuminated a set of boot prints in the soft earth, Jake's distinctive Merrill hiking boots, unmistakable. The prints led directly into the circle of white stones. "This is where it gets weird," Steve continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the prints inside the circle." I knelt beside him, following his flashlight beam. The prints continued for about 6 feet into the circle, clear and deep in the soft earth. Then they just stopped. Not faded, not obscured, but stopped as if Jake had simply vanished mid-step. "That's impossible," Marcus said. "People don't just disappear." "The prints are fresh," I pointed out, touching the edge of one with my finger. The earth was still soft, still held the perfect impression of Jake's boot tread. We spent the next hour searching frantically, expanding our search radius in increasingly desperate circles around the camp. We found nothing. No more footprints, no broken branches, no sign that Jake had ever existed. "We need to hike out and get help," Marcus said as dawn began to filter through the trees. "Call the rangers, get a search party." "With what?" Steve held up his dead phone. "And it's a 2-hour hike back to the car. What if Jake comes back while we're gone?" "What if he doesn't?" Marcus countered. "What if whatever happened to him happens to us?" In the end, we decided that Steve and Marcus would hike out to get help while I stayed behind in case Jake returned. It wasn't a decision any of us felt good about, but splitting up seemed less risky than all of us leaving. I watched them disappear down the trail, fighting the urge to call them back. The forest felt different in daylight, less overtly threatening but somehow more watchful. I rebuilt the fire and settled in to wait, telling myself that Jake would probably come stumbling back with a sheepish grin and a story about getting lost while answering nature's call. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the forest came alive with normal sounds: birds calling, squirrels rustling through the leaves, the distant drone of insects. I began to relax slightly, even managing to eat some of the food Steve had left behind. It was just after noon when I heard footsteps approaching from the direction Steve and Marcus had gone. "About time," I called out, relieved that they'd returned so quickly. "Did you find Jake? Did you get—" The words died in my throat as Jake emerged from the trees. He looked exactly the same as when I'd last seen him. Same clothes, same gear, same easy stride, but something was wrong. Fundamentally, horribly wrong. "Hey, Mike," he said, his voice carrying the same inflection and tone I'd heard thousands of times before. "Sorry I worried you. Got turned around in the dark." "Jake?" I stood up slowly, every instinct screaming danger despite the familiar figure before me. "Where have you been?" "Just exploring. Lost track of time." He smiled, the expression perfectly normal except for something I couldn't quite identify. "Where are the others?" "They went for help. We've been looking for you all night." I was backing away without realizing it, my body responding to signals my conscious mind hadn't processed yet. "All night?" Jake tilted his head slightly. "But I just left. It's only been a few minutes." That's when I noticed his eyes. Jake had brown eyes. Always had, ever since I'd known him. But the person standing before me had pale blue eyes, the color of winter ice. "You're not Jake," I whispered. The thing wearing Jake's face smiled wider, and I saw that its teeth were wrong too. Too sharp, too many of them. "Of course I'm Jake," it said in Jake's voice. "Who else would I be?" I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a panicked animal, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the thing following. Not running, just walking at the same steady pace, but somehow keeping up effortlessly. "Mike," it called in Jake's voice. "Where are you going? Come back to camp." I didn't stop to answer. I had no plan beyond getting as far away as possible from whatever was wearing my friend's face. The forest blurred past me, and I realized I was heading deeper into the gorge rather than toward the trail, but I didn't dare stop to correct my course. The pursuing footsteps stopped suddenly, and I risked a glance back. Nothing. The forest was empty except for the normal sounds of birds and insects. I kept running until my lungs felt like they were on fire, then collapsed behind a massive oak tree, gasping for breath and trying to think. My phone was still dead. My GPS unit had been in my tent back at camp, and I was now thoroughly lost in thousands of acres of wilderness. But I was alive, and whatever that thing was, it wasn't Jake. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to find my way back to the main trail, using the sun and my increasingly unreliable memory of the topographic maps Jake had studied. The forest seemed to actively resist my efforts. Trails that I was certain led back toward the parking area would curve mysteriously in the wrong direction, and landmarks I thought I recognized turned out to be completely unfamiliar when approached from a different angle. As evening approached, I was forced to accept that I was going to spend another night in the woods. I found a sheltered spot between two large boulders and gathered enough dry wood for a small fire. The temperature was dropping again, and without my sleeping bag or proper gear, I was going to have a miserable time of it. The fire helped, both for warmth and for the psychological comfort of light in the growing darkness. I tried to stay alert, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of the thing that had taken Jake's form, but exhaustion and shock were taking their toll. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of voices. Steve and Marcus were calling my name, their voices echoing through the forest. Relief flooded through me as I realized they'd come back with help. "Here!" I shouted, adding more wood to my fire to make it more visible. "I'm here!" The voices grew closer, and soon I could see flashlight beams moving through the trees. But as they approached, something made me pause. The voices weren't quite right. Steve's voice was too high, Marcus's too deep, and they were saying my name wrong. Michael instead of Mike, which none of my friends had called me since elementary school. I let my fire burn down to barely glowing coals and crouched behind the larger boulder, peering through a gap between the rocks. 3 figures emerged into the small clearing where I'd made camp. In the dim firelight, they looked exactly like Jake, Steve, and Marcus. Same clothes, same gear, same general proportions. But their movements were wrong, too synchronized, like dancers following choreography rather than friends searching for a missing companion. "Michael," the Steve thing called, its voice carrying that same wrong inflection I'd heard from Jake earlier. "Where are you, Michael?" "We're here to help," added the Marcus thing. The Jake thing said nothing, but I could see it studying the ground around my fire, following my footprints with predatory intensity. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still as they searched the area. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they moved on, their synchronized footsteps fading into the distance. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then waited another hour for good measure. When I finally emerged from my hiding spot, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to follow what I thought was the trail back to the parking area, I would head toward the nearest major road and try to flag down help. According to the maps Jake had shown us, Highway 715 ran roughly parallel to this section of the Daniel Boone National Forest, about 3 miles to the east. If I could find it, I could follow it to civilization. I struck out through the forest, using the stars for navigation and moving as quietly as possible. Every shadow could hide one of those things. Every sound could signal their approach. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and without proper gear, hypothermia was becoming a real concern. It was nearly dawn when I finally stumbled onto a gravel road that I prayed would lead to the highway. My feet were numb, my hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I was pretty sure I was in the early stages of hypothermia. But I was alive, and I was out of the immediate danger of the forest. The gravel road led to a small farm, where an early-rising elderly man named Earl Peterson took one look at my condition and bundled me into his kitchen without asking questions. His wife Martha fed me hot coffee and eggs while Earl called the sheriff's department. The official search for my 3 friends lasted 6 days and involved dozens of volunteers, tracking dogs, and helicopter overflights. They found our campsite exactly as I'd described it: the stone circles, the dead electronics, the footprints leading to nowhere. They found no trace of Jake, Steve, or Marcus. The investigators were kind but skeptical. 3 grown men don't just vanish without a trace, they said. There had to be a logical explanation. I stuck to the facts as much as possible, leaving out the supernatural elements that no one would believe anyway. I told them we'd gotten separated during the night. I told them I'd gotten lost trying to find help. I told them I'd seen what I thought were my friends but couldn't reach them before they disappeared again. All of it was true, in a way. The case remains open, officially. 3 missing persons, no evidence of foul play, no leads worth pursuing. The families held memorial services after 6 months. Steve's parents asked me to speak at his service, and I did my best to honor the memory of my real friend rather than the thing that had worn his face in those woods. I've never been camping since then. I moved away from Louisville, changed jobs, tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Daniel Boone National Forest. But sometimes, late at night, my phone will ring with no caller ID. When I answer, I hear familiar voices calling my name. Jake's voice, Steve's voice, Marcus's voice. They sound exactly right now, perfect imitations that might fool anyone who hadn't seen what I'd seen. They ask where I am, why I left them behind, when I'm coming back to visit. I always hang up. But the calls keep coming, and I can't shake the feeling that someday I might be weak enough to answer. Someday I might be lonely enough to believe that the voices belong to my real friends, that they somehow survived and found their way back. The forest is patient, and it remembers. And sometimes, in my weakest moments, I find myself missing them so much that I almost don't care if the voices are real or not. Almost. The only thing that stops me from going back is the memory of those pale blue eyes staring out of Jake's face, and the knowledge that whatever took my friends is still out there, still wearing their skin, still calling my name in their voices, still waiting for me to come home. My name is David Jones, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest near Chimney Top Rock in Kentucky during the 3rd week of October 2024. I should have listened to the ranger at the visitor center. When I mentioned we were planning to camp near the old mining trails below Chimney Top Rock, his weathered face had darkened. "Folks don't usually come back from that area the same," he'd muttered, scratching at a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. "Been too many disappearances. Too many changes." But Michael Williams, my best friend since college, had laughed it off. "Superstitious mountain folk," he'd said with that cocky grin that had gotten us into trouble more times than I could count. Jennifer Williams, Michael's younger sister, had rolled her eyes at both of us. "You're both idiots," she'd said, shouldering her pack with practiced ease. At 25, she was already a more experienced hiker than either of us, having spent the last 3 years leading wilderness survival courses in Colorado. "The only thing we need to worry about is Michael's cooking." We'd been planning this trip for months. Michael was going through a brutal divorce, and I'd just lost my job at the marketing firm in Louisville. Jennifer had suggested we needed to get back to basics and remember what really mattered. The irony of those words would haunt me for the rest of my life. The trail to our planned campsite wound through dense hardwood forest, the autumn leaves creating a canopy of gold and crimson above us. The familiar weight of my pack felt comforting, and for the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. We joked about old times, shared trail mix, and took photos of Jennifer posing dramatically on fallen logs. But as we climbed higher, something began to feel wrong. It started with the silence. Forests are never truly quiet. There's always the rustle of small animals, the call of birds, the whisper of wind through leaves. But as we ascended the narrow trail toward Chimney Top Rock, these sounds gradually faded until we walked in an oppressive hush broken only by our own footsteps and labored breathing. "Where are all the birds?" Jennifer asked, stopping to adjust her hiking boots. Her voice seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Michael wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Probably migrating south. It's late October." But I'd hiked these mountains before, and this felt different. Wrong. The very air seemed to press against us, thick and heavy despite the cool temperature. The familiar earthy scent of decomposing leaves was tainted with something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. We reached our planned campsite just as the sun began to set behind the ridge. It was a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by towering oaks and maples. The guidebook had described it as a peaceful spot with easy access to water and excellent views of the surrounding peaks. What it hadn't mentioned was how the shadows seemed to move independently of the swaying branches, or how the creek's babbling sounded almost like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. "This place gives me the creeps," Jennifer said as she dropped her pack. She was staring at something carved into the bark of a massive oak tree, symbols that looked ancient and deliberately obscured by decades of bark growth. "Probably just old logging marks," Michael said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He was looking up at the canopy, where something had rustled despite the absence of any wind. We set up camp quickly, driven by an unspoken urgency as darkness crept through the forest. My hands shook as I struggled with my tent stakes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes I found myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. The fire was the worst part. Michael had always been good with fires. It was one of his few outdoor skills that rivaled Jennifer's. But that night, the flames behaved strangely. They flickered and danced in patterns that defied the gentle breeze, occasionally flaring bright blue or sickly green before returning to normal orange. The wood hissed and popped as if it were wet, though it had been seasoned and dry when we'd gathered it. "Something's wrong with this wood," Michael muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "It keeps trying to go out." Jennifer was crouched beside the creek, filling our water bottles. "The water tastes funny too," she called back. "Metallic, like pennies." I was digging through my pack, looking for the camp stove, when my fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. It was a small cloth pouch, tied with sinew and filled with what felt like bones and dried herbs. The smell that wafted from it was the same cloying sweetness we'd noticed on the trail, now concentrated and nauseating. "Did either of you put this in my pack?" I asked, holding up the pouch. They both turned to look at me, and in the flickering firelight their faces seemed momentarily unfamiliar, shadows falling in wrong places, features subtly distorted. "What is it?" Jennifer asked, stepping closer. "I don't know. Some kind of..." I started to say charm or fetish, but the words died in my throat as the pouch began to warm in my hands. Not just warm, hot enough that I dropped it with a yelp. The moment it hit the ground, the forest erupted in sound. Not natural sounds. Something between a howl and a scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flared so high that we all stumbled backward, and for just a moment, I swear, I saw shapes moving in the flames. Human shapes, writhing and reaching toward us with charred, skeletal fingers. Then silence returned, more oppressive than before. "We should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "First thing in the morning. This place is... cursed." Michael's laugh was forced and brittle. "Come on, David. There's got to be a logical explanation. Maybe it's some kind of geological phenomenon. Underground gases or something?" But Jennifer was staring at the spot where I'd dropped the pouch. It was gone, leaving only a circle of blackened earth that smoldered despite the lack of any visible fire. We barely slept that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to sounds that made no sense. Footsteps circling our camp, whispers that seemed to come from inside my own tent, and twice the distinct sound of someone crying, though when I called out, my companions were silent in their own tents. Morning brought no relief. We woke to find our food supplies had spoiled overnight, despite being sealed in bear-proof containers. The bread was green with mold, the dried meat had turned black and reeked of decay, and our fresh fruit had shriveled to hard, bitter husks. "This is impossible," Jennifer said, holding up a banana that looked like it had been rotting for weeks. "I bought this yesterday. It was perfectly ripe." Worse still, our maps no longer made sense. The trail we'd followed to reach the campsite simply wasn't marked on any of them. Our GPS units showed our location as being miles from where we actually were, and our phones had lost all signal, their batteries draining despite being fully charged the night before. "We need to get out of here," I insisted. "Something is seriously wrong with this place." Michael was examining the creek where Jennifer had filled our water bottles. The water that had run clear the night before was now dark and stagnant, covered with a film that reflected rainbow colors like an oil slick. "Which direction?" he asked. "If the maps are wrong and the GPS is off, how do we know which way leads back to the trailhead?" It was a good question. The forest around us looked the same in every direction: dense, dark, and somehow malevolent. The trail we'd followed had vanished, leaving only faint deer paths that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. "We follow the creek downstream," Jennifer decided. "Water always flows toward civilization eventually." But as we packed our remaining gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The symbols carved into the oak tree had changed. Where there had been a few simple marks the night before, there were now dozens of intricate designs covering the entire trunk. They seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and staring at them too long made my head ache. "Jen," I called, "look at the tree." She turned and her face went pale. "Those weren't there yesterday." "Yes, they were," Michael said absently, rolling up his sleeping bag. "You pointed them out when we arrived." Jennifer and I exchanged glances. Michael was wrong. There had only been a few faint marks, not this elaborate tapestry of symbols that seemed to tell some ancient, horrifying story. "Michael," I said carefully, "do you remember what you had for dinner last night?" He looked up at me with a confused expression. "Dinner? We didn't have dinner. The fire wouldn't stay lit, remember?" But we had eaten. Trail mix and energy bars, shared around the flickering, color-changing flames while strange sounds echoed through the forest. Michael had made jokes about the fire's odd behavior. How could he not remember? Jennifer grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Something's wrong with him," she whispered. But when I looked at Michael again, he seemed perfectly normal, just tired and frustrated like the rest of us. Had I imagined the confusion in his eyes? Was the stress of this place making me paranoid? We set off downstream, following what remained of the creek. The water grew more stagnant as we walked until it was little more than a series of dark pools connected by trickles of black liquid that smelled like sulfur and decay. The trees pressed closer together, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it felt like walking through a tunnel. It was Jennifer who first noticed the bones. They started as scattered fragments. A rib here, a femur there, half buried in the leaf litter and so old they'd turned gray with age. At first, we assumed they were deer bones, or maybe elk. But as we continued downstream, the bones became more numerous and more obviously human. "Jesus Christ," Michael breathed, kneeling beside a skull that grinned up at us from the base of a massive pine. "How many people have died out here?" The skull showed signs of violence, deep gouges that could only have been made by teeth or claws, and a hole in the back that looked like it had been made by something sharp and cruel. Worse still, it wasn't old. Bits of dried flesh still clung to the bone, and the empty sockets seemed to follow us as we passed. "We need to get out of here," I said again, but my voice sounded weak and distant. The oppressive atmosphere was affecting my ability to think clearly. Everything felt dreamlike and unreal, as if I were moving through thick syrup. "Which way?" Jennifer asked, and I realized we'd stopped walking. I couldn't remember for how long we'd been standing there, staring at the skull. The sun, what little we could see of it through the canopy, seemed to be in the wrong position. That's when we heard the singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. A woman's voice, high and sweet, singing something that might have been a lullaby. It seemed to come from deeper in the forest where the trees grew so thick that they created walls of shadow. "Hello," Jennifer called out. "Is someone there? We're lost." The singing stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of our own heartbeats seemed to penetrate it. Then the voice came again, but closer, much closer. "Help me," it said. And now it was clearly coming from our right, though I couldn't see anyone through the trees. "Please, I'm hurt. I can't move." "Stay together," I said, but Michael was already pushing through the underbrush toward the voice. "Someone's in trouble," he said. "We can't just ignore it." "Michael, wait!" Jennifer grabbed for his arm, but he'd already disappeared into the trees. The voice came again, pleading and desperate. "Please, hurry, I'm bleeding. Something attacked me." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed Michael into the dense underbrush. Jennifer was right behind me, her breathing sharp and panicked. The trees here were different, older, more twisted, their bark scarred with the same symbols we'd seen at our campsite. We found Michael standing in a small clearing, staring at something I couldn't see. His face was blank, his eyes unfocused. "Where is she?" I asked. "Where's who?" he replied, not looking at me. "The woman, the one calling for help." Michael turned to face me, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His features were the same, but something behind his eyes was different. Cold, hungry. "There's no woman," he said with a smile that was too wide and showed too many teeth. "There never was." That's when Jennifer screamed. I spun around to see her pointing at the ground around Michael's feet. The earth was littered with bones, but these were fresh, still bloody, still wearing scraps of clothing and jewelry. A park ranger's badge lay half buried in the leaf litter, and beside it, a child's sneaker that couldn't have been there more than a few days. "Michael," I said slowly, backing away, "we need to leave, now." But Michael wasn't Michael anymore, not entirely. He tilted his head at an angle that was too sharp, too bird-like, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Leave," he said, "but we just got here, and I'm so very hungry." Jennifer grabbed my hand and pulled me backward out of the clearing. We ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush behind us. I could hear Michael laughing, but the sound was wrong. Too high, too shrill, like the cry of a hunting hawk. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a stream that looked cleaner than the stagnant pools we'd been following. The water ran clear and cold, and for a moment I thought we might have found our way back to normal forest. "What happened to him?" Jennifer gasped, splashing water on her face. "What the hell happened to Michael?" I didn't have an answer. I'd read about Wendigos in college during a comparative mythology class, but those were just stories, legends created to explain harsh winters and starvation in the northern wilderness. They weren't real. But as I knelt beside the stream, I saw my reflection in the water, and for just a moment, it wasn't my face looking back at me. The features were sharper, more predatory, and the eyes were completely black. "David?" Jennifer's voice seemed to come from very far away. "David, are you okay?" I blinked and my reflection returned to normal, but the feeling remained. A cold, gnawing hunger that had nothing to do with our spoiled food supplies. "I'm fine," I lied, "just tired." But I wasn't fine. Something was changing inside me. Something triggered by the cursed pouch, or the symbols on the trees, or simply by spending too much time in this corrupted place. I could feel it like a parasite in my mind, whispering suggestions that became harder to ignore with each passing hour. "She looks delicious," the voice said, "so young and tender, so afraid." "We should keep moving," I said, standing up quickly. The hunger was getting stronger, and I didn't trust myself to be near Jennifer much longer. "Moving where?" she asked. "We're completely lost. Our supplies are ruined, and something has happened to my brother." "Your brother is dead," I said, the words coming out harsher than I'd intended. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Michael anymore. Jennifer started crying then, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. The sound made the hunger worse, turned it into something sharp and immediate. I found myself staring at the pale skin of her neck, imagining how easy it would be to... No. I forced the thought away, biting down on my tongue hard enough to draw blood. The pain helped clear my head, if only temporarily. "There," I said, pointing upstream. "I can see daylight through the trees. Maybe we can find high ground, get our bearings." It was a lie. The forest ahead looked just as dark and twisted as everywhere else. But I needed to keep moving, needed to stay focused on getting Jennifer to safety before the thing inside me became too strong to resist. We climbed for what felt like hours, the stream growing smaller and clearer as we gained elevation. Gradually, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The trees became more normal. Typical Kentucky hardwoods without the twisted shapes and unnatural scars. Birds began to call in the distance, and the air smelled of autumn leaves instead of decay. "I think we're getting out of it," Jennifer said, hope creeping into her voice. "Whatever that place was, I think we're leaving it behind." But I could still feel the hunger, cold and patient in the back of my mind. Waiting. We crested a ridge and found ourselves looking down at a valley I recognized. Highway 27 cut through it like a gray ribbon, and I could see the roof of the Daniel Boone National Forest Visitor Center in the distance. "We made it," Jennifer laughed, tears streaming down her face. "We actually made it." I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt only disappointment. The hungry thing inside me had been looking forward to the long, dark hours of night still ahead. It had been planning. "David?" Jennifer was looking at me with concern. "Are you okay? You look... I look like what?" "Pale. And your eyes..." She stepped back from me. "Your eyes look wrong." I could feel them changing, the irises expanding until they swallowed the whites entirely. The hunger was rising now, no longer content to whisper suggestions. It wanted blood. It wanted fresh meat. It wanted to crack bones between its teeth and suck out the marrow. "Run," I managed to say through gritted teeth. "Jennifer, run." To her credit, she didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted down the slope toward the highway, her hiking boots slipping on the loose shale but somehow keeping her upright. I tried to follow, tried to help her escape, but my body no longer obeyed my commands. Instead, I found myself pursuing her with inhuman speed and grace, bounding down the hillside like a predator that had been built for this exact purpose. The rational part of my mind screamed in horror, but it was growing smaller and quieter with each passing second. Jennifer was fast, but I was faster. I caught up with her just as she reached the edge of the highway, my hands closing around her shoulders with enough force to drive her to her knees. "Please," she gasped. "David, I know you're still in there. Fight it." For a moment, her words penetrated the hunger. I saw myself as if from outside, crouched over my best friend's sister like some feral animal, my fingernails grown into claws, my teeth sharp and yellowed. The rational part of my mind surged forward, horrified by what I'd become. "Let her go," I told myself. "This isn't you. This isn't who you are." But the Wendigo's voice was stronger now, drowning out my own thoughts with its cold, endless hunger. "She hurt you," it whispered. "They all hurt you. They took your job, your dignity, your future. They deserve this." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Some part of me, the part that was still David Jones, truly was sorry. Then I heard the sound of an engine, and headlights swept across us as a car rounded the bend. Jennifer screamed and waved her arms, and I felt the Wendigo's hold on me falter in confusion. The thing inside me understood wilderness and darkness and ancient hungers, but it had no context for modern technology. The car, a park ranger's SUV, skidded to a halt beside us. The same weathered ranger who had warned us at the visitor center stepped out, but now he carried a shotgun loaded with shells that gleamed with more than simple metal. "Step away from her, son," he said calmly. "I know what you're becoming, and I know how to stop it." The Wendigo snarled and tried to flee, but the ranger was faster. The first shot took me in the shoulder, spinning me around and dropping me to the asphalt. The second shot hit me center mass, and suddenly the cold hunger was replaced by a different kind of cold, the kind that came with blood loss and shock. As I lay dying on the highway, I felt the Wendigo's presence evaporating like smoke. My last conscious thought was relief. Relief that Jennifer was safe, that the thing inside me hadn't been able to complete its transformation, that at least one of us would make it home. But that wasn't the end of the story. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Somerset, Kentucky. The doctors said it was a miracle, that the shotgun blasts should have killed me instantly, but somehow I'd survived with only minor injuries. The wounds had healed with supernatural speed, leaving only faint scars as evidence of what had happened. Jennifer visited me once. She looked pale and hollow-eyed, and she flinched when I tried to touch her hand. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "The ranger said you fought it off long enough for him to arrive. He said most people don't have that kind of strength." I wanted to tell her the truth, that I hadn't fought anything off, that I'd been fully consumed by the Wendigo's hunger and only stopped by the ranger's intervention. But I could see in her eyes that she needed to believe I was still the David she'd known, that some part of her brother's best friend had survived intact. So I lied. "I'm just glad you're okay," I said. She nodded and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "The ranger said Michael's body was never found. He said sometimes, in places like that, they never are." After she left, I stared at the ceiling and tried to ignore the whisper of hunger that still echoed in the back of my mind. The doctors said I was healing remarkably well, that I'd be able to go home soon. They didn't understand that I could never really go home. Not when I could still feel the Wendigo's presence like a splinter in my soul, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. Not when I caught myself staring at the nurses with an expression that made them uncomfortable. Not when I woke up each morning tasting copper and craving something I couldn't name. The ranger visited me on my last day in the hospital. He sat in the plastic chair beside my bed and studied me with eyes that had seen too much. "How long do I have?" I asked. "That depends on you," he said. "Some folks fight it their whole lives and die human. Others give in the first time they get hungry enough." "And if I give in? Then I'll be waiting," he said simply. "With a silver shot and a blessing from the Shawnee medicine woman who taught me how to hunt things like you." He left a business card on the nightstand. Just his name and a phone number. No official title or agency. But I understood. He was part of something unofficial, something that dealt with the problems that regular law enforcement couldn't handle. I kept the card. It's been 6 months now since our trip to Daniel Boone National Forest. I've moved to a cabin in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, far from anyone who might get hurt if I lose control. I survive on canned food and bottled water, and I've learned to recognize the signs when the hunger starts to build. The ranger checks on me once a month, always carrying his shotgun, always watching for changes in my behavior. So far, I've managed to stay human, mostly, but the Wendigo is patient. It whispers to me in the dark hours before dawn, reminding me how much better fresh meat tastes than canned beans. It shows me dreams of the hunt, of the exquisite moment when prey realizes it cannot escape. It promises that surrender would be so much easier than this constant vigilance. Some nights, when the hunger is especially strong, I call Jennifer. I never say anything, just listen to her voice on the answering machine, reminding myself why I have to keep fighting. She's moved to California, the ranger told me, started a new life far from Kentucky's cursed forests. I hope she's happy. I hope she's forgotten the hollow look in my eyes as I crouched over her on that dark highway. I hope she never has to learn the truth about what I've become, because the worst part isn't the hunger or the isolation or the constant threat of losing myself to an ancient evil. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in the deep woods near Chimney Top Rock, Michael is still out there, still changed, still hungry, and sometimes on the clearest nights when the wind is just right, I can hear him calling my name. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Red River Gorge, deep in Kentucky's Daniel Boone National Forest, where the ancient sandstone cliffs hide secrets that should never see daylight. The four of us worked together at Henderson Manufacturing. Jennifer Davis from accounting, Robert Johnson from the warehouse, Sarah Rodriguez from HR, and myself from quality control. We'd been planning this weekend camping trip for months, a chance to decompress from the soul-crushing monotony of our jobs. Jennifer had found the spot online, a primitive camping area near the Clifty Wilderness, miles from the nearest road or cell tower. "Perfect for disconnecting," she'd said with that bright smile of hers, the one that could convince anyone to do anything. Sarah had been hesitant. She suffered from severe claustrophobia, and the thought of being surrounded by dense forest made her nervous. But Robert, ever the optimist, had talked her into it. "Come on, Sarah, when's the last time you saw real stars?" he'd said, his weathered face crinkling into a grin. At 52, Robert was the oldest among us, a widower who'd taken up hiking after his wife died. "Besides, we'll all be together. Nothing bad ever happens when you've got good people watching your back." How wrong he was. We left Louisville on Friday afternoon, driving southeast through increasingly rural country until we reached the Bert T. Combs Mountain Parkway. The GPS started acting up around Campton, the satellite connection flickering in and out as we wound deeper into the mountains. By the time we turned onto the Forest Service road that would take us to our camping spot, we were navigating by paper map and instinct. The dirt road was barely wide enough for one vehicle, hemmed in by towering hemlocks and massive rhododendron bushes that scraped against the windows. My Honda Pilot groaned and lurched over ruts and exposed roots. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we reached a small clearing beside Wolf Pen Creek. "This is it," Jennifer announced, consulting her printed directions. The clearing was perhaps 50 feet across, ringed by ancient trees whose canopy blocked out most of the late afternoon sun. The creek gurgled nearby, dark water flowing over moss-covered stones. It was beautiful in a primal way, but something about the place felt wrong, like we were intruding on something that had been undisturbed for far too long. We set up camp efficiently. Robert and I pitched the tents while Jennifer and Sarah gathered kindling for a fire. The silence was oppressive. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just the constant whisper of wind through the leaves high above. Even Sarah noticed it. "It's too quiet," she murmured, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warm October air. "Forests are supposed to be full of life." "Maybe we're just deep enough that the animals aren't used to people," I offered, though I didn't believe it myself. I'd camped plenty of times, and this felt different. Wrong. As darkness fell, we built a fire and tried to recapture the excitement we'd felt during the drive down. But conversation came in fits and starts, punctuated by long silences that seemed to stretch on forever. The flames danced strangely, sometimes flaring green or blue when there was no reason for the color change. We attributed it to minerals in the wood, though none of us really believed that explanation. Robert was the first to notice that his phone had completely died, despite being fully charged when we arrived. Then Jennifer's GPS unit went dark. My compass spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. Sarah's digital camera flickered through its memory, displaying photos we'd never taken, blurry images of trees that looked familiar but wrong, faces in the shadows that resolved into nothing when we looked closer. "Electronics always get screwy in the mountains," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Magnetic fields, iron ore, who knows what's down here?" We turned in early, the oppressive atmosphere having drained our enthusiasm for stargazing or campfire stories. I shared a tent with Robert while Jennifer and Sarah bunked together. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I could hear the creek babbling nearby, but occasionally the sound would change, becoming almost like whispered voices having a conversation just below the threshold of understanding. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of a zipper. My tent flap was open, cold air flowing in, and Robert's sleeping bag was empty but unzipped from the inside. My watch read 2:17 a.m. "Robert," I whispered into the darkness beyond the tent. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled outside. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting everything in blood-red shadows. I called Robert's name louder, and a moment later heard the other tent unzipping. "What's wrong?" Jennifer's voice was thick with sleep. "Robert's gone. His sleeping bag was empty." Sarah emerged behind Jennifer, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "Gone where? There's nowhere to go out here." We spent 20 minutes searching the immediate area, calling Robert's name and sweeping our flashlights through the forest. But the beam seemed to die after only a few feet, swallowed by a darkness that felt almost solid. We found his boots by the creek, neatly placed side by side as if he'd deliberately removed them before wading in. "Maybe he went for a midnight swim," Jennifer suggested, but her voice shook. The creek was only knee-deep and ice-cold with mountain runoff. We were about to give up and wait for dawn when we heard him coming back through the trees. Heavy footsteps crashed through the underbrush, snapping branches with no regard for stealth. My flashlight caught him emerging from between two massive oaks about 30 feet downstream. "Robert! Thank God, we were worried sick." Jennifer rushed toward him, but I grabbed her arm. Something was wrong. Robert walked with a strange, stilted gait, his arms hanging loose at his sides. His feet were bare and muddy, but he showed no sign of discomfort from the rocky ground. When my light hit his face, he smiled, a wide, empty expression that stretched his features in ways that didn't look quite human. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice sounded flat, inflectionless. "Just needed some air." "Air?" Sarah stepped closer, squinting at him in the dim light. "Robert, you've been gone for almost an hour. Where were you?" "Walking." The smile never wavered. "Just walking." I played my flashlight over him more carefully. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his body, but there was something else, a smell like stagnant pond water and decay that made my stomach turn. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's, though they'd never done that before. "You're soaking wet," I pointed out. "Did you fall in the creek?" "No." Still that terrible smile. "I don't remember falling." Jennifer looked between Sarah and me, clearly troubled but trying to maintain normalcy. "Well, let's get you into some dry clothes. You'll catch pneumonia." Robert nodded mechanically and followed us back to the camp. But as he walked past me, I caught another whiff of that awful smell. Not just stagnant water, but something deeper and more wrong. Something like meat left too long in the sun. He disappeared into his tent to change, and we huddled around the rekindled fire speaking in whispers. "Something's not right," Sarah murmured, her claustrophobia forgotten in the face of a more immediate fear. "The way he was looking at us—" "He probably just wandered off and got turned around," Jennifer said, but she kept glancing toward Robert's tent. "You know how disorienting the dark can be." "His eyes," I said quietly. "Did you see his eyes? They were reflecting the light." "It's just the angle," Jennifer insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. From inside Robert's tent came the sound of rustling fabric. Then silence. Too much silence. I waited for the sound of him settling into his sleeping bag, but it never came. "Robert," I called softly. "You okay in there?" "Fine." His voice came immediately as if he'd been waiting for the question. "Going to sleep now." But there was no sound of movement, no creaking of the tent floor. It was as if he was sitting perfectly still in the darkness, waiting. We eventually returned to our tents, but sleep was impossible. I lay awake listening for any sound from Robert's side of our shared space, but heard nothing. No breathing, no shifting around, nothing at all. It was like camping next to a corpse. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the dense canopy into a gray half-light that did nothing to lift our spirits. I unzipped my sleeping bag and looked over at Robert's. Empty again, but this time the bag looked like it had been shredded from the inside, long tears in the fabric that definitely hadn't been there the night before. I scrambled outside to find Jennifer and Sarah already awake, standing by the cold fire pit with expressions of barely controlled panic. "He's gone again," Sarah whispered, "and look at this." She pointed to the ground around our camp. The earth was churned up as if a struggle had taken place, but the pattern was wrong. Long furrows that looked like claw marks, far too large to have been made by any animal I could identify. They led from Robert's tent toward the creek, then disappeared into the forest beyond. "We need to get out of here," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Right now." Jennifer shook her head. "We can't just leave him." "Look at those marks, Jennifer. Look at them and tell me what animal makes tracks like that." She stared at the gouges in the earth, her face growing pale. They were easily 6 inches long and curved like massive talons. But what made them truly terrifying was their arrangement. They appeared to have been made by something walking upright. "Maybe it's a bear," she said weakly. "Bears can walk on their hind legs." "Bears don't have claws like that," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "And they don't take people." We began breaking camp with frantic efficiency, stuffing gear into packs without regard for organization. All I wanted was to get back to the car and drive away from this place as fast as possible. But as we worked, I became aware of a sound from deep in the forest. A low, rhythmic thumping like someone slowly beating a drum. The sound grew louder as we packed, and with it came that awful smell again. Decay and stagnant water and something else underneath it all. Something that made my primitive brain scream warnings I didn't understand. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, freezing in the act of rolling up her sleeping bag. We all stopped to listen. The thumping continued, but now I could make out another sound beneath it. A wet, tearing noise like someone ripping apart raw meat with their bare hands. "Robert," Jennifer called into the forest, but her voice cracked on his name. The sounds stopped immediately, followed by a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere in the darkness between the trees, came Robert's voice. "Jennifer, is that you?" But the voice was wrong, too deep, with an echo that suggested it was coming from somewhere vast and empty. And underneath the words was another sound, a wet clicking like someone trying to speak around a mouth full of broken glass. "Robert, we're leaving," I shouted into the forest. "Come back to camp right now." "I can't." The voice was closer now, though I couldn't see him. "I'm hurt. Something happened to me." Jennifer took a step toward the trees. "Where are you? We'll come help you." "No," Sarah grabbed her arm. "Don't you dare go in there." But it was too late. The thing that had been Robert emerged from between 2 massive hemlocks, and what I saw made my mind try to shut down rather than process the horror before me. It still wore Robert's clothes, but the body inside them had been changed, elongated. The arms now hung past the knees, ending in hands with fingers that had split open to reveal bone beneath the flesh. Its face was Robert's face, but stretched and distorted, the mouth opening far too wide to reveal rows of teeth that definitely hadn't been there before. Worst of all were its eyes, still Robert's kind brown eyes, but filled with a desperate intelligence that somehow made the transformation even more terrible. It knew what it had become. "Help me," it whispered, and its voice was Robert's voice wrapped around something that had never been human. "I don't know what's happening to me," Jennifer screamed, a high, keening sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Sarah grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, her claustrophobia exploding into full panic as the forest seemed to close in around us. The thing that had been Robert tilted its head, studying our terror with something like curiosity. Then it smiled with that too wide mouth, and I saw that its teeth weren't just sharp. They were moving, writhing like tiny worms in its gums. "I'm so hungry," it said conversationally. "I've been hungry since I came back. Do you know what I'm hungry for?" I didn't wait to find out. Grabbing the largest pack, I shoved Sarah toward the trail that led back to our car. "Run!" I yelled. "Run now!" We crashed through the forest like deer fleeing a wildfire, branches whipping at our faces and roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us came a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could be made by something with a throat full of broken bones. Then Jennifer stumbled. She'd been keeping pace despite her shorter legs, but a moss-covered log caught her foot and sent her sprawling. I turned back to help her up, and that's when I saw that the thing was much closer than it should have been. Impossibly close, as if it could move through the forest without regard for the normal constraints of space and time. Jennifer was scrambling to her feet when those elongated arms reached her. The fingers, no longer fingers but something like bone spears wrapped in rotting flesh, punched through her jacket and into her back. She made a sound I'll never forget, a wet gasp that spoke of punctured lungs and severed arteries. "Michael," she whispered, blood foaming at her lips. "Run!" The thing lifted her off the ground, and I could see its face over her shoulder. Still recognizably Robert, but something else looking out through his eyes. Something ancient and hungry that had found a willing host. "She tastes like fear," it said in Robert's voice. "Fear makes the meat tender." I ran. Sarah was already 50 yards ahead, crashing through the underbrush like a terrified animal. I caught up with her just as she reached the creek, and together we splashed across the icy water without regard for our footing. Behind us, Jennifer's screaming stopped. We ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, following the dim trail by instinct and adrenaline. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but the memory of those terrible bone fingers kept me moving. Sarah was making small whimpering sounds with each breath, her claustrophobia combining with sheer terror to push her to the edge of complete breakdown. When we finally saw my Honda through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. We were going to make it. We were going to get out of this nightmare and drive back to civilization and try to convince ourselves that what we'd seen hadn't really happened. But as we approached the car, Sarah grabbed my arm again. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." Someone was sitting in the passenger seat. Through the tinted windows I could make out a familiar silhouette. Robert, or the thing that had been Robert, was waiting for us, still wearing that horrible smile. As we watched, it turned toward us and waved with one of those elongated, bone-fingered hands. "How?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "How did it get here before us?" I didn't have an answer. The thing in the car opened the door and unfolded itself like a spider emerging from its web. Standing upright, it was easily 7 feet tall. Though Robert had been no more than average height, its clothes hung in tatters from the transformed frame. "Going somewhere?" it asked in Robert's voice, but the words were accompanied by that wet, clicking sound again. "I thought we were having such a nice camping trip." Sarah broke. The combination of claustrophobia, terror, and hopelessness sent her into complete hysterics. She turned and ran back into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. I started to follow her, but the thing moved with inhuman speed, placing itself between me and the trees. "Let her go," it said, tilting its head in that unsettling way. "She'll come back when she gets hungry enough. They always do." I backed away slowly, trying to put the car between myself and the creature. My hand found the spare key in my pocket. I'd insisted on bringing it in case we locked ourselves out. Maybe if I could get to the driver's side. "You're wondering how I got here so fast," the thing said, following my movements with those terrible eyes. "Time works differently in the deep places, Michael. I've been walking these woods for hours, days, years. How long have you been running?" The question made my head spin. It felt like we'd been fleeing for only minutes, but now I wasn't sure. The quality of light filtering through the canopy seemed wrong. Too dim for morning, too bright for evening. My watch had stopped at some point, the hands frozen at 2:17 a.m. "What are you?" I managed to ask. "Hungry," it replied simply. "Always so very hungry." Do you know what it's like to be hungry for something you can't name? To crave something that lives inside other people? Something warm and bright that makes them human? It took a step closer, and I could see that its chest was moving wrong. Too fast, like a bird's, as if whatever was inside that stolen body needed more oxygen than human lungs could provide. "Robert fought me," it continued conversationally. "At first, he's still in here somewhere, screaming, but the hunger is stronger than his will. It's always stronger." I edged around the back of the car, keeping the vehicle between us. The thing matched my movements perfectly, like we were dancing some macabre ballet. "Jennifer screamed beautifully," it said, and for a moment Robert's face showed through the mask of wrongness, a flash of the man I'd known, trapped and horrified. "But she was only an appetizer. You and Sarah, you'll be the main course." I dove for the driver's door, jamming the key into the lock. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God for reliable Japanese engineering, and I threw the car into reverse without looking. The thing that had been Robert leaped onto the hood with inhuman agility, its bone fingers screeching against the metal as it tried to find purchase. Its face was pressed against the windshield, Robert's features stretched into something barely recognizable. The mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing a throat that descended into darkness far deeper than any human neck should contain. I spun the wheel hard and slammed on the brakes, trying to throw it off. The creature held on, its fingers punching through the metal of the hood like it was cardboard. Black ichor leaked from the wounds in its hands, sizzling where it hit the paint. Desperate, I floored the accelerator and aimed for the nearest tree. The impact threw me forward against the steering wheel hard enough to crack ribs, but it had the desired effect. The thing was launched from the hood to collide with the oak's massive trunk. For a moment it lay still, its limbs twisted at angles that would have killed anything truly human. Then it began to laugh. The sound was Robert's laughter run through some cosmic garbage disposal, emerging as a bubbling, wet cackle that spoke of things no human throat should be able to produce. It climbed to its feet, or what passed for feet now, and I saw that the impact had done nothing but reveal more of its true nature. Bones protruded from torn flesh, but there was no blood, only that black ichor that seemed to move with a life of its own. I reversed away from the tree and spun the car around, tires spraying dirt and dead leaves. The forest road stretched ahead of me like a tunnel into hell, but it was the only way out. In my rearview mirror, I could see the thing watching me go, still wearing Robert's face like a mask that no longer quite fit. The drive back to the main road was a nightmare of switchbacks and washouts that I navigated purely on instinct. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, and twice I nearly drove off the narrow track into the ravines below. But eventually I saw pavement ahead, and beyond that, the blessed sight of electric lights and civilization. I didn't stop driving until I reached the police station in Stanton, nearly 40 miles away. The desk sergeant listened to my story with the expression of someone accustomed to dealing with hysterical tourists who'd gotten spooked in the woods. When I mentioned Jennifer and Sarah, his attitude became more serious, but I could tell he thought we'd simply gotten separated and that I was overreacting to what was probably a tragic but mundane accident. They sent a search and rescue team into the Red River Gorge the next day. They found our campsite without difficulty. The churned earth and shredded tent made it easy to locate. They also found Jennifer's body, or what was left of it, hanging from a tree branch 30 feet off the ground. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, though several of the searchers privately admitted they'd never seen anything like the wounds before. They never found Sarah. Or Robert. The search continued for weeks, expanding to cover hundreds of square miles of wilderness. But the Daniel Boone National Forest is vast and wild, full of caves and hollows where a person could disappear forever. I know they're still out there. Both of them. Sarah probably didn't last long. Her claustrophobia would have driven her deeper into the forest, away from any hope of rescue, until she encountered something even worse than what we'd left behind. But Robert, the thing that had been Robert? I have a feeling it's still walking those ancient trails, still hungry, still wearing a human face like an ill-fitting costume. Sometimes, late at night, my phone rings with calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's nothing but the sound of breathing, too fast, too shallow, like something that doesn't quite understand how human lungs are supposed to work. Then a voice that might be Robert's asks if I want to go camping again. The connection is always bad, full of static that sounds almost like screaming if you listen closely enough. I don't go camping anymore. I live in the city now, surrounded by lights and people and the constant noise of civilization. But on quiet nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can smell that awful stench of stagnant water and decay drifting through my apartment windows. And sometimes, in the reflection of my darkened windows, I see a face that looks almost like Robert's, if Robert had been stretched and twisted into something that was only pretending to be human. The thing is still out there, somewhere in the hollows of Red River Gorge, still hungry, still waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into its territory, still wearing Robert's face, though by now it probably fits a little better. And Sarah, God, I hope Sarah is dead. Because if she's not, if she's become something like what Robert became, then there are two of them out there now. Two hungry things that remember just enough of their humanity to be truly dangerous. I've thought about going back, about trying to find them and put an end to whatever they've become. But I know I'm not brave enough for that kind of confrontation. I'm not even sure bullets would stop something that could punch through steel with its bare hands. So I stay in the city, and I try not to think about camping trips or the sound of something large moving through the forest at night. I try not to remember the way Robert looked at me with those terrible eyes, or the wet sound Jennifer made when those bone fingers punched through her back. But sometimes I dream about it. In my dreams, I'm back in that clearing beside Wolf Pen Creek, and Robert is emerging from the forest with that awful smile. In my dreams, I don't run. I stand there and let him approach, let those elongated arms wrap around me, let those moving teeth find my throat. In my dreams, the hunger finally makes sense, and when I wake up, I can taste stagnant water and decay in my mouth, and I wonder if the thing in the forest is calling to something that's growing inside me, something that's been growing ever since that night in the Red River Gorge, feeding on my memories of terror and loss, something that's getting hungrier every day. The dreams are getting stronger, more vivid, more appealing. I'm starting to think about taking another camping trip. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest, deep in the Red River Gorge area of eastern Kentucky, where the ancient sandstone cliffs rise like tombstones from the earth and the hollows run so deep that sunlight never touches their floors. It was supposed to be a simple team-building weekend. Our marketing firm had been hemorrhaging employees, and our boss thought a camping trip might boost morale. 4 of us volunteered: myself, Jessica Davis from accounting, Brandon Edwards from graphic design, and Amy Mitchell from sales. Christopher Hernandez, our newest hire in digital marketing, rounded out our group. None of us were particularly outdoorsy, but the company was footing the bill for gear rental, and we figured how hard could it be? We should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching 30 miles out from our destination. "Take the next right," the robotic voice announced, directing us toward what looked like a logging road that disappeared into a wall of eastern hemlocks. "That can't be right," Jessica said from the passenger seat, squinting at her phone. "This road isn't even on the map." I pulled over and grabbed the paper map we'd picked up at the ranger station. The red line marking our route to the Chimney Top campground was clear enough, but when I tried to match it to our current location, nothing lined up. Roads that should have been there weren't, and roads that were there shouldn't have existed. "Maybe the maps are just old," Brandon suggested from the back seat, though his voice carried an uncertainty that made my skin prickle. "These mountain roads change all the time, right? Washouts and new construction." Christopher, who'd been unusually quiet since we'd left Lexington, just stared out the window at the darkening forest. Something about his expression bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "Let's just follow the GPS," I decided. "If it gets too sketchy, we'll turn around." The logging road wound deeper into the forest than any road had a right to. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches scraping against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we emerged into a clearing that definitely wasn't on any map. "This place gives me the creeps," Amy whispered, and I couldn't disagree. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, as if they were listening. In the center sat a fire ring made of blackened stones, and scattered around it were the remnants of previous campsites: rotting tent stakes, rusty cans, a sleeping bag so faded and torn it looked like it had been there for decades. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Jessica asked, but even as she spoke, I was checking the GPS again. According to the screen, we were exactly where we were supposed to be. We set up camp as the sun disappeared behind the tree line, the shadows rushing in like a tide. The silence was oppressive. No bird songs, no insect buzz, just the whisper of wind through the branches and the occasional creak of old wood. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the forest was swallowing sound. Brandon tried to lighten the mood by cracking jokes as we assembled our tents, but his laughter had a forced quality that made it worse than the silence. Christopher helped with the setup but barely spoke, and when he did, his words came out flat and monotone. "You feeling okay, man?" I asked him as we gathered rocks for a fire ring. He looked at me with eyes that seemed strangely unfocused. "Fine, just tired." But it was more than tired. There was something hollow about the way he moved, like he was operating on autopilot. I'd worked with Christopher for 6 months, and while he'd always been quiet, this was different. This was absence. We got a fire going as full darkness settled over the clearing. The flames should have been comforting, but they cast dancing shadows that made the surrounding forest look like it was alive and writhing. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Anyone else hearing that?" Amy asked suddenly. We all stopped talking and listened. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of burning wood. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere in the trees. Not quite a drumbeat, not quite footsteps, but something in between. "Probably just a woodpecker," Brandon said, but his voice was tight. "At night?" Jessica shook her head. "Woodpeckers don't drum at night." The sound continued for several minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed felt heavy and expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. "I need to take a leak," Christopher announced, standing up so suddenly that we all jumped. "Don't go too far," I called after him as he disappeared into the trees, but he didn't acknowledge me. He was gone for almost an hour. "Should we go look for him?" Amy asked, glancing nervously at the wall of darkness beyond our fire's reach. "He's a grown man," Jessica said, but I could hear the worry in her voice. "He can handle taking a piss in the woods." When Christopher finally returned, something was wrong. He moved differently. Too fluid, too quiet, like he was gliding rather than walking. In the firelight, his face looked pale and drawn, and his eyes reflected the flames in a way that made them look hollow. "You okay?" I asked. "You were gone a while." "Got turned around," he said, settling back into his spot by the fire. "Dark out there." But there was something in his voice, a quality I couldn't identify. It wasn't quite his voice anymore. The inflection was wrong, the rhythm off, like someone doing an imperfect imitation. Jessica seemed to notice it too. She kept glancing at Christopher with a puzzled expression and finally said, "Chris, didn't you tell us earlier that you went to UK for college?" Christopher stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes." "What was your major again?" Another pause, longer this time. "Business." But I remembered our conversation from the office Christmas party. Christopher had studied art history at Georgetown, not business at UK. He'd been passionate about medieval illuminated manuscripts, of all things. I started to correct him, then stopped. The way he was looking at Jessica made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. We turned in around 11, but sleep didn't come easily. My tent was positioned so I could see the dying fire through the mesh door, and beyond it, Christopher's tent. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest and watching the red glow fade to orange, then to barely visible embers. Sometime deep in the night, I heard movement outside. Soft footsteps circling our camp, pausing at each tent. I held my breath and tried to peer through the darkness, but I couldn't make out anything except vague shapes that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely. The footsteps stopped outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. Something was crouched just inches from my head, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. The breathing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, then moved on. I didn't sleep at all after that. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the daylight made everything worse by revealing what the darkness had hidden. Our campsite was surrounded by tracks. Not animal tracks, but impressions in the soft earth that looked almost human but were wrong in fundamental ways. The feet were too long, the stride too wide, and there were only 4 toes instead of 5. "What the hell made these?" Brandon asked, crouching down to examine one of the clearer prints. "Bear, maybe," Jessica suggested, but she sounded doubtful. I looked over at Christopher, expecting him to weigh in, but he was just staring at the tracks with an expression I couldn't read. Not confusion or fear, but something that looked almost like recognition. "We should pack up and get out of here," Amy said. "This place is freaking me out." But when we tried to leave, we discovered that our car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, despite the fact that it had run perfectly fine the day before. The battery was fully charged, we had plenty of gas, and there were no obvious mechanical problems. "It's like something's draining the power," I muttered, popping the hood for the 3rd time. "Cars don't just stop working for no reason," Brandon said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were stranded. The second day was worse than the first. Our food began to rot despite being properly stored, developing a putrid smell that attracted clouds of flies. The water in our bottles turned brackish and undrinkable. Even our GPS and phones, which had been working intermittently, went completely dead despite showing full battery the night before. Christopher's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, always claiming he was just exploring or gathering firewood, but he never brought back any wood. When he was in camp, he would sit motionless for long periods, staring into the forest with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "He's freaking me out," Amy whispered to me when Christopher was out of earshot. "It's like he's not even there anymore." She was right. Whatever had come back from the woods that first night, it wasn't entirely Christopher. On the 3rd day, Jessica went missing. She had gone to gather water from a stream we'd found about a 1/4 mile from camp. When she didn't return after 2 hours, we organized a search. We found the water bottles abandoned by the stream, and leading away from them, 2 sets of tracks, Jessica's boots and those same wrong, too long footprints we'd been seeing around our camp. "Jessica!" I called until my voice was hoarse, but the forest swallowed my shouts without even an echo. We searched until dark, then returned to camp defeated and terrified. Christopher seemed strangely calm about the whole thing, which only made it worse. "She probably just got lost," he said. "She'll find her way back." But there was something in his tone, not quite satisfaction, but close to it, that made my blood run cold. Jessica came back just after midnight. I was lying awake in my tent, listening to Amy cry softly in hers when I heard footsteps approaching our camp. Slow, measured steps that I recognized as Jessica's gait. Relief flooded through me, and I was about to unzip my tent and call out to her when something made me stop. The footsteps were wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. And there was another sound underneath them, a wet, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the dirt. I peered through the mesh of my tent door and saw Jessica standing at the edge of our camp. At least, it looked like Jessica. Same height, same build, same blonde hair. But she was standing perfectly still, arms at her sides, facing our tents but not moving toward them. Just standing there in the darkness, watching. "Jessica," I whispered. She turned her head toward my tent, and in the faint starlight I could see her face. It was Jessica's face, but wrong in a way that made my mind rebel against what I was seeing. Her eyes were too wide, too dark, and her mouth was stretched in a smile that was too big for her features. When she moved, it was with the same fluid, unnatural grace I'd noticed in Christopher. "Hello, Michael," she said, and her voice was exactly right. Same pitch, same cadence. But there was something underneath it, like an echo of something else speaking. I didn't answer. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay quiet, stay hidden, don't let her know I was awake. Jessica stood there for another minute, then turned and walked to Christopher's tent. I heard the sound of his zipper opening, then hushed voices too low for me to make out words. After a few minutes, both figures emerged and walked into the forest together, moving with that same unsettling glide. They didn't come back before dawn. When morning came, Amy and Brandon were as shaken as I was. They had seen the same thing, Jessica returning wrong, the whispered conversation with Christopher, both of them disappearing together into the trees. "That wasn't her," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That thing wasn't Jessica." "Then where is she?" Brandon demanded. "What happened to the real Jessica?" I didn't have an answer, but I was starting to have a terrible suspicion. The tracks around our camp, Christopher's strange behavior, the way both of them moved now, it all pointed to something I didn't want to believe. The Wendigo. I'd heard the stories growing up, the Native American legends about cannibalistic creatures that haunted the deep forests. Beings that were once human, but had been twisted by an insatiable hunger for flesh. They were supposed to be myths, campfire stories to scare children. But the behavior I was witnessing, the mimicry, the wrongness, the way they moved, it all fit. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now, on foot if we have to." But when we tried to leave the clearing, we found ourselves walking in circles. No matter which direction we headed, no matter how carefully we marked our path, we always ended up back at our campsite within an hour. The forest had become a maze with no exit. Christopher and the thing wearing Jessica's face returned that evening as we sat around a fire we could barely keep lit. The flames kept guttering and changing color. First red, then blue, then an sickly green that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. "Where have you been?" I demanded as they approached our fire. "Exploring," Christopher said in that flat, emotionless voice. Jessica wanted to see more of the forest. The Jessica thing smiled that too wide smile. "It's beautiful out there," she said. "So many interesting things to see." Amy started crying then. Quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands. The sound seemed to excite the two figures. Christopher tilted his head like a dog hearing a high-pitched whistle, and Jessica's smile grew even wider. "What's wrong with Amy?" the Jessica thing asked, but there was no concern in her voice, only curiosity, like she was observing an interesting specimen. "She's scared," Brandon said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Scared of what?" Christopher asked, taking a step closer to Amy. "Of you," I said. "Both of you. You're not you anymore." Christopher looked at me with those hollow, reflecting eyes. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." I stood up, putting myself between him and Amy. "I know what you are. Both of you." The mask slipped then, just for a moment. Christopher's face twisted into something inhuman, all teeth and hunger and predatory intelligence. Then it snapped back into place, but now I could see the effort it took to maintain the facade. "You should sleep," he said. "You're not thinking clearly." But I wasn't going to sleep. None of us were going to sleep ever again if I could help it. The attack came just after midnight. I was keeping watch while Brandon and Amy tried to rest when I heard Amy scream. I spun around to see Christopher dragging her from her tent, his fingers, which had become long and claw-like, wrapped around her throat. The Jessica thing was standing over Brandon, who was struggling weakly in his sleeping bag. "Run!" I shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing was surrounded by impenetrable darkness, and I knew from our earlier attempts that the forest would just lead us in circles. Christopher looked at me with those terrible hollow eyes and smiled. His teeth had become pointed, and his jaw had stretched to accommodate them. "Michael," he said, and his voice was layered now, like multiple people speaking in unison. "Join us. The hunger is so much easier when you stop fighting it." Amy was making choking sounds as Christopher's claws tightened around her throat. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at him, but he moved with inhuman speed, releasing Amy and catching my wrist before the makeshift weapon could connect. His skin was cold as ice and felt like leather. When he squeezed, I heard bones creak. "We were human once," he whispered, and I could smell decay on his breath. "Just like you. But the forest showed us what we really are, what we've always been. Hungry." The Jessica thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass. so hungry. I managed to wrench free and stumbled backward, still holding the burning branch. Amy was gasping and clutching her throat, and Brandon was sitting up in his sleeping bag looking dazed and confused. "The fire," I gasped. "Stay near the fire." The two creatures circled us like wolves, staying just outside the ring of light cast by our campfire. They moved with perfect coordination, as if they shared a single mind. "Fire won't save you," Christopher said. "Not forever, and we're so very patient." They were right. The fire was already burning low, and we were running out of fuel. Once the flames died, we would be defenseless. That's when I remembered something from the old stories. Wendigos were fast and strong, but they were still bound by certain rules. They couldn't enter a dwelling uninvited, they were vulnerable to certain materials, and most importantly, they retained some connection to their human selves. "Christopher," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I know you're still in there somewhere. Remember your art history degree? You loved those medieval manuscripts. You said they were windows into the past." For just a moment, something flickered behind those hollow eyes. Confusion, maybe even recognition. "You don't remember," I continued. "But I do. You were passionate about those old books. You said they showed how humans have always tried to make sense of the darkness around them." "Stop," the Jessica thing hissed, but I could see uncertainty creeping into Christopher's expression. "Georgetown University," I said. "Professor Martinez's class on medieval illumination. You wrote your senior thesis on the influence of Celtic mythology on insular art." Christopher's face contorted with pain, and for a moment I could see the real Christopher underneath, confused, terrified, fighting against something vast and hungry that had invaded his mind. I remember," he whispered, and his voice was almost human again. But the Jessica thing snarled and reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, the confusion left his eyes and the predatory intelligence returned. "Nice try," he said, but his voice was shaking now. The control wasn't perfect. That's when Amy surprised us all. While Christopher was distracted, she had been quietly reaching for something in her backpack. Now she stood up, holding a small silver cross on a chain, a gift from her grandmother that she never went anywhere without. "Get back," she said, her voice hoarse from where Christopher had choked her. Both creatures recoiled as if she had brandished a flamethrower. The Jessica thing actually screamed, a sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. "Silver," I breathed. Of course, the old stories always mentioned silver. Amy stepped forward and the creatures retreated. For the first time since this nightmare began, we had an advantage. But it didn't last long. The Jessica thing recovered first, her face twisted with rage. "Clever," she snarled, "but you can't hold that forever." She was right. Amy's hand was already shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. And even if the cross could keep them at bay, we were still trapped in this clearing with no way out. That's when Brandon did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. He grabbed a burning log from the fire and charged at the Jessica thing, swinging it like a club. The creature moved to dodge, but the burning wood caught her across the shoulder. The impact sent her spinning, and I heard something crack, either the log or one of her bones. She landed hard and didn't get up immediately. But Christopher roared, a sound no human throat should be able to make, and launched himself at Brandon. His claws raked across Brandon's chest, tearing through fabric and flesh like it was paper. Brandon screamed and fell backward, blood spreading across his shirt. I didn't think. I just moved. Grabbing another piece of burning wood, I swung it at Christopher's head. This time I connected and the impact sent him staggering. The smell of burning hair filled the air. "The car!" I shouted to Amy. "Try the car again." She ran for our vehicle while I tried to keep the creatures at bay with my improvised torch. Christopher was bleeding from where I'd hit him, black blood that steamed in the cold air, but he was already recovering. The Jessica thing was back on her feet too, moving with a distinct limp but still dangerous. I heard the car engine turn over once, twice, then catch. The sound was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. "It's working," Amy shouted. I grabbed Brandon under his arms and dragged him toward the car. He was conscious but losing a lot of blood. "Come on," I grunted. "Stay with me." Christopher and the Jessica thing were advancing again, moving more slowly now but with the implacable persistence of predators who knew their prey was wounded. I could see calculation in their eyes. They were going to rush us as soon as we let our guard down. "Get in the car," I told Amy. "Now." She helped me load Brandon into the back seat, then jumped behind the wheel. I took one last swing with my torch to keep the creatures back, then dove into the passenger seat. "Drive," I shouted, and Amy floored it. We crashed through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing, branches scraping against the windows and tearing at the paint. In the rearview mirror, I could see Christopher and the Jessica thing standing in the firelight, watching us go with those terrible hollow eyes. But we were moving. After 3 days of being trapped, we were finally moving. The logging road seemed different now, shorter, more direct. Roads that had been confusing before now made perfect sense. It was as if the forest had been playing tricks on us, distorting space and direction to keep us trapped. Now that we had broken free, the spell was broken. We didn't stop driving until we reached the ranger station 20 miles away. Brandon needed medical attention, and we needed to report what had happened. But how do you tell someone that your co-workers have been possessed by cannibalistic forest spirits? How do you explain that the woman they're going to find, if they find her, isn't really Jessica anymore? In the end, we told them that Christopher and Jessica had gotten lost in the woods, and that Brandon had been injured in a fall. It wasn't the truth, but it was close enough to avoid awkward questions about our sanity. The search teams found Christopher's body 3 days later, or what was left of it. According to the coroner's report, he had been dead for at least a week, killed by some kind of animal attack. But that was impossible. We had been talking to him, traveling with him, right up until the night we escaped. They never found Jessica at all. The official story was that she had fallen into one of the deep crevices that honeycombed the Red River Gorge area. Her body was presumably wedged somewhere in the limestone caves below, inaccessible to recovery teams. The case was closed after 2 weeks of searching. Brandon recovered from his injuries, though he still bears the scars across his chest. We don't talk about what happened in the woods. Not to each other, not to anyone. Who would believe us? But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end. Slow, deliberate breathing that's too familiar. And sometimes when the caller finally speaks, it's in Jessica's voice. "Hello, Michael," she says. "I'm still hungry." Then the line goes dead. I've changed my number 3 times, but the calls keep coming, because whatever took Jessica and Christopher is still out there in the Daniel Boone National Forest, wearing their faces and carrying their memories. Still hungry, and I know that someday it's going to come looking for the ones who got away. I don't go camping anymore. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest, deep in the Cumberland Gap region of southeastern Kentucky, where the ancient Appalachian Mountains hold secrets older than memory. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus suggested we camp at Hensley Settlement. The abandoned mountain community sits isolated on Brush Mountain, accessible only by a grueling 4-mile hike through dense forest. "It'll be perfect," he'd said during our lunch break at the accounting firm where we all worked. No cell towers, no tourists, just us and the wilderness. Sarah Chen had been the first to agree, her dark eyes lighting up with the prospect of photographing the historic log cabins. "I've been wanting to shoot there for my portfolio," she'd said, already scrolling through her phone for reference images. "The light filtering through those old structures will be incredible." Brian Torres, ever the skeptic, had shaken his head. "You know, people died up there, right? Harsh winters, isolation, madness. There's a reason they abandoned the place." "That's exactly why it'll be amazing," Marcus had countered, his boyish grin infectious. "No crowds, authentic atmosphere. Come on, when's the next time we'll all have a 3-day weekend?" Emma Morgan had been quiet during the discussion, picking at her salad with uncharacteristic nervousness. When we'd pressed her, she'd finally admitted, "My grandmother used to tell stories about that area, about things that watched from the woods." Native American folklore, Brian had dismissed. Every forest has its ghost stories. Now, as I struggled up the rocky trail with my 30-pound pack cutting into my shoulders, I wondered if Emma's grandmother had been trying to warn people about something real. The October air carried the crisp promise of an early winter, and the leaves created a canopy of gold and crimson above us. It would have been beautiful if not for the oppressive silence. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of our labored breathing and boots crunching on fallen leaves. "How much further?" Sarah gasped, pausing to adjust her camera bag. Marcus consulted his GPS, frowning. "According to this, we should be there already, but the trail markers don't match what I'm seeing on the map." "Technology fails you in places like this," Emma said quietly. She'd been growing more withdrawn as we climbed higher. "The mountain doesn't like to be mapped." Brian rolled his eyes. "Mountains don't have preferences, Em. It's probably just GPS drift from the tree cover." But I noticed he kept glancing at his own phone, and the frustrated expression on his face suggested his device wasn't working properly either. We pushed on for another hour, the trail becoming increasingly overgrown and difficult to follow. The trees seemed to press closer together, creating a tunnel of shadows that made it impossible to tell what time it was. Finally, we emerged into a clearing where several log structures sat in various states of decay. "This is it," Marcus announced, though he sounded less confident than before. "Hensley Settlement." The abandoned homestead felt wrong from the moment we arrived. The cabins, built in the early 1900s by mountain families seeking isolation, sat empty and dark. Windows stared like hollow eyes, and the doors hung open as if the inhabitants had fled in the middle of the night, which, according to the historical records, they essentially had. "It's smaller than I expected," Sarah murmured, already unpacking her camera. "But the light is perfect for that Gothic atmosphere I'm going for." We set up camp in the main clearing between the largest cabin and what had once been a barn. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the settlement, the temperature dropped rapidly. I was grateful for the warmth of our campfire, though I noticed it took an unusually long time to get the flames going. "The wood's green," Brian explained, though the logs looked dry to me. "Probably absorbed moisture from the fog." Emma sat close to the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest. My grandmother said the Cherokee called this area the place where spirits walk. They avoided it except for certain ceremonies. "What kind of ceremonies?" I asked, though something in her tone made me wonder if I really wanted to know. "The kind where they asked forgiveness from things that shouldn't be disturbed." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, guys. We're educated adults. Let's not start spooking ourselves on the first night." But as darkness fell completely, bringing with it a silence so absolute it felt heavy, I found myself glancing nervously at the tree line. Something about the forest felt different now, as if we were being observed by countless unseen eyes. Sarah was the first to notice her photos weren't turning out right. "That's weird," she muttered, scrolling through her camera's display. "Look at this." She showed us a picture she'd taken of the main cabin just before sunset. In the window of the seemingly empty structure, a pale face stared out at the camera. The features were human, but wrong somehow. The eyes too large, the mouth stretched in an expression that might have been a smile or a grimace. "It's probably just a reflection," Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Or pareidolia. You know, seeing faces in random patterns." "I've been doing photography for 10 years, Sarah replied. "I know the difference between a reflection and—" She gestured at the screen. "Whatever this is." That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified in the mountain stillness. The crack of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the trees, and something else. A rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Around 3 a.m., I heard Emma whimpering in her sleeping bag. When I whispered her name, she sat up abruptly, her face pale in the dying firelight. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "The tapping?" "No, the humming. Someone's humming a lullaby." I listened carefully but heard only silence. Yet Emma's terror was real, and it was contagious. We sat together until dawn, feeding the fire and jumping at every shadow. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the daylight made things worse. In the harsh October sun, the settlement looked even more desolate, and I noticed details I'd missed the night before. Scratches around the windows and door frames as if something with claws had tried to get in. Or out. "Where's Marcus?" Sarah asked as we gathered around the rekindled fire for breakfast. I looked around the camp. His sleeping bag was empty but unzipped from the inside and his boots were missing, but his backpack and all his gear remained untouched. "Maybe he went to find water," Brian suggested, though the nearest stream was marked on our map as being nearly a mile away. "Without telling anyone? Without taking his pack?" Emma shook her head. "That's not like him." We called his name, our voices echoing strangely in the clearing. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the forest rather than carrying through it, as if the trees themselves were swallowing our calls. "He probably just went to relieve himself," Brian said, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Give him an hour." An hour became 2, then 3. We searched the immediate area, following faint trails that led nowhere and calling until our voices were hoarse. The forest seemed to shift around us, trails appearing and disappearing, landmarks moving when we weren't looking directly at them. It was Sarah who found the first sign of him. "Over here," she called from the edge of the settlement. We rushed to where she stood, staring at the ground. In the soft earth near the tree line was a single footprint, definitely Marcus's boot, based on the distinctive tread pattern. But beside it was something else, a print that looked almost human, but elongated, with what appeared to be claw marks where toes should be. "What the hell made that?" Brian whispered. Emma stepped back from the prints as if they might bite her. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't abandon Marcus," I protested, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "Look at the tracks, Jen. They go into the forest together, walking side by side. Marcus went willingly with whatever made those prints." The implication hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah raised her camera to photograph the tracks, but when she pressed the shutter, nothing happened. The display showed a corrupted image, pixels scattered like static. "The camera's broken," she said, but her voice suggested she didn't believe it was a technical malfunction. We spent the rest of the day searching, though our efforts became increasingly half-hearted as the forest seemed to actively work against us. Trails led in circles, our compass spun wildly, and the shadows moved independently of the sun's position. By evening, exhausted and terrified, we returned to camp. That's when we saw him. Marcus sat by our dead fire, his back to us, completely motionless. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I nearly collapsed. "Marcus, thank God we've been looking everywhere for you." But as we approached, something made me slow down. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Marcus hadn't moved at our approach, hadn't turned around or acknowledged us in any way. He just sat there, perfectly still, facing the forest. "Marcus," Brian called, his voice strained. Slowly, unnaturally, Marcus's head began to turn. It rotated further than a human head should be able to turn, a full 180 degrees, until he was looking at us with his back still facing away. His face was Marcus's face, but empty. The eyes were glassy and unfocused, and his mouth hung open in a slack smile that revealed too many teeth. Emma screamed. The thing that looked like Marcus stood up, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. When it spoke, it was Marcus's voice, but the words came out in the wrong rhythm, as if something was struggling to remember how human speech worked. "Why, did you call for me? I am here now. We can continue our camping. "That's not Marcus," Emma whispered, backing away. "That's not him anymore." The Marcus thing tilted its head at an impossible angle. "I am Marcus. See? I have his face, his voice, his memories." It smiled wider, and I saw that its canine teeth had been replaced by something sharp and yellowed. "I remember working in the office with numbers and papers. I remember suggesting this trip." "What did you do with him?" I demanded, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "I am him," it replied, taking a step toward us, "and soon you will be yourselves, just improved." That's when I noticed the smell, decay and wild musk, like a predator's den mixed with rotting meat. The scent was coming from the Marcus thing, though its clothes were clean and its appearance was exactly as I remembered. "Run," Emma breathed. We ran. The forest had become a maze of twisted paths and impossible geometries. Trees that had been on our left suddenly appeared on our right, and the settlement seemed to chase us through the woods, always visible through the trees no matter which direction we fled. Behind us, I could hear the Marcus thing calling in its broken voice. "Where are you? Going? We should stay together. That is what friends do." Sarah stumbled, her camera bag catching on a low branch. She went down hard, and I heard her ankle snap. Brian and I pulled her to her feet, but she couldn't put weight on the injured leg. "Leave me," she gasped. "I'm slowing you down." "Not happening," I said, though I could hear the thing crashing through the underbrush behind us, getting closer. We found a small cave carved into the hillside, partially hidden by fallen logs. It was barely large enough for the four of us, but we squeezed inside and tried to stay quiet. Sarah bit her jacket to muffle her whimpering, and Brian held his hand over her mouth when the pain became too much. The Marcus thing found us within minutes. "I can smell you," it said from just outside the cave entrance. Fear has such a distinctive scent. Through the gaps in the logs, I could see its silhouette against the moonlight. But the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung past its knees and a posture that suggested its spine bent in ways human spines shouldn't. "Come out and we can talk about this, like friends do, like civilized people." When we didn't respond, it began to pace back and forth in front of the cave. Each time it passed, I caught glimpses of its true form. The face was still recognizably Marcus's, but the features shifted and flowed like melting wax. Sometimes it had his brown eyes, sometimes yellow ones that reflected light like an animal's. The mouth stretched and contracted, occasionally revealing rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's jaw. "I know what you're thinking," it continued. "You think I'm not really your friend Marcus, but consciousness is such a fluid thing. Memories, personality, the spark that makes someone human. I have all of these now, plus improvements." Emma was shaking so violently I could feel it through the cave floor. She grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard I thought my bones might break. "It's a skinwalker," she whispered directly into my ear, the words barely audible. "My grandmother told me. They steal the skins of the dead and wear them like clothing, but they can never get it quite right." "Marcus isn't dead," I whispered back. "Isn't he?" The pacing stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the thing's voice came from directly outside our hiding spot, so close I could feel its breath through the gaps in the logs. "Oh, Emma," it said, and now its voice carried perfect human inflection, all the awkward pauses and wrong rhythms gone. "Your grandmother was a wise woman. She taught you well." Emma's grip on my hand became painful. "But she didn't tell you everything, did she? She didn't mention that we don't just steal the skins of the dead. Sometimes we borrow from the living, and sometimes, if we're very careful, we can keep them alive while we wear them." A log shifted, and suddenly there was a gap large enough for the thing to reach through. A hand that looked exactly like Marcus's but felt wrong somehow groped blindly in our direction. Brian grabbed a sharp rock and brought it down hard on the searching fingers. The thing screamed, but the sound that came out was animal, a howl of rage and pain that no human throat could produce. "You broke my perfecting fingers," it snarled, the broken speech pattern returning. "Now I will have to fix them. Fix all of you." The logs began to move as it tore at our makeshift barrier. We pressed ourselves against the back of the cave, but there was nowhere to go. Sarah was sobbing now, her injured ankle forgotten in the face of immediate death. That's when Brian did something incredibly stupid and incredibly brave. He grabbed his hiking knife and squeezed through the gap at the back of the cave, planning to circle around and attack the thing from behind. We heard him moving through the underbrush, trying to be quiet, but failing. The Marcus thing heard him too. It stopped tearing at the logs and tilted its head like a dog listening to a distant sound. How interesting. The brave one thinks he can hunt the hunter. It moved away from our hiding spot and we heard it crashing through the forest in pursuit of Brian. For a few minutes, there was silence. Then Brian's scream echoed through the trees, a sound of such pure agony that it made my blood freeze. The screaming went on for a long time. Too long. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. "That's one down," the thing called from somewhere in the darkness. But now its voice came from multiple directions at once, as if there were several of them surrounding us. "Who wants to be next?" Emma was hyperventilating. "It's multiplying," she gasped. "Or there were always more of them. My grandmother said they hunt in packs, but they share consciousness. What one learns, they all know." Sarah had gone into shock, her face pale and clammy despite the cold. I checked her pulse and found it racing and irregular. We needed medical attention, but we were miles from civilization and surrounded by monsters wearing our friend's face. "I have an idea," I whispered to Emma, "but you're not going to like it." "What?" "Your grandmother's stories. Did she ever mention how to fight them?" Emma nodded slowly. "Fire. They hate fire. And cold iron, and—" She paused, looking embarrassed. "They can't cross running water. The stream Marcus marked on his map. If we can reach it, that's almost a mile away, and Sarah can't walk." I looked at our injured friend who was mumbling incoherently and shivering despite the thermal blankets we'd wrapped around her. "Then we carry her. Jen, be realistic. We'll never make it. We'll never survive here either. At least this way we have a chance." The voices outside were getting closer again, and now I could distinguish multiple different tones. The thing had been busy while we'd been hiding. "Ladies," it called in Marcus's voice, "I found your friend Brian. Would you like to see him?" Something was dragged past the cave entrance, leaving a wet trail in the dirt. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of familiar clothes and a shape that might once have been human. But the proportions were all wrong, as if Brian had been stretched on a medieval rack. "He's still technically alive," the Marcus thing continued, "though he's having some adjustment issues. The borrowing process doesn't always go smoothly." A wet, gasping sound came from the direction of Brian's body, the sound a person might make if their lungs had been filled with something other than air. Emma was crying now, tears streaming silently down her face. "We're all going to die here." "Not if I can help it," I said, and began gathering our supplies. I stuffed everything useful into one backpack: water, first aid kit, what little food we had left, and most importantly, a small bottle of lighter fluid I'd brought for the campfire. "What are you doing?" "Creating a distraction." I soaked one of our spare shirts with the lighter fluid and wrapped it around a branch to make a torch. Then I used our emergency flare to light it. The flame burned bright and hot, filling the cave with dancing shadows. "Fire," Emma breathed. "They won't like that." The voices outside had gone quiet. "On my count," I whispered. "We run for the stream. You support Sarah's left side, I'll take her right. Don't stop for anything." "Jen, This is insane. 1. I could hear movement outside, but it sounded different now, more cautious. 2. Sarah seemed to sense what was happening and struggled to focus. I can try to walk. 3. We burst out of the cave like a small explosion, the torch held high in my free hand. The things that had once been Marcus and Brian recoiled from the flame, their stolen faces contorting in expressions of pain and rage. But in the firelight, I could see their true forms. They were tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and joints that bent the wrong way. Their skin was a mottled gray-green, and where it had split to accommodate their unnatural growth, I could see something dark and wet underneath. The faces they wore sat on their heads like poorly fitted masks, occasionally slipping to reveal the skull-like features beneath. We ran through the forest, half carrying Sarah between us. Behind us, the creatures howled in frustration and gave chase, but the torch kept them at a distance, and gradually we began to put space between us and our pursuers. The problem was that the torch was burning too fast. The lighter fluid had made it bright but brief, and I could see we had maybe 10 minutes before it burned out completely. "How much further?" I gasped as we stumbled through the underbrush. Emma consulted the compass, though I noticed the needle was spinning wildly. "I think maybe half a mile, but I can't be sure. Nothing's making sense anymore." Sarah's breathing was becoming more labored, and I could feel her weight increasing as she lost the strength to support herself. "Leave me," she whispered. "Please, save yourselves." "Shut up," I said. "We're all getting out of this." But I could hear the creatures getting closer again. They'd overcome their fear of the flame and were matching our pace, staying just outside the circle of light. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of them moving through the trees, their stolen faces grinning at us with too many teeth. That's when I heard it, the sound of running water. "The stream!" Emma cried. "I can hear it!" We crashed through the last line of trees and found ourselves on the bank of a fast-moving creek about 6 feet wide. The water was ice-cold and crystal clear, flowing over a bed of smooth stones. The creatures burst out of the forest behind us and immediately stopped at the water's edge, as if they'd hit an invisible wall. "Cross!" Emma shouted. "Quickly!" We splashed into the stream, the shock of the cold water taking our breath away. Sarah screamed as the icy current hit her injured ankle, but we pulled her across to the far bank. The things that had been our friends stood on the opposite shore, their faces cycling through expressions of rage and frustration. The Marcus thing spoke first. "You cannot stay there forever. The water grows. Shallow downstream. We will wait. And we know where you live," added the Brian thing, its voice a wet whisper. "We know where you work, your families, your friends." But something in their posture suggested they couldn't cross the running water, at least not easily. Emma's grandmother had been right about that much. We followed the stream downstream for miles, staying in the water despite the numbing cold. Every time we tried to climb out and continue on dry land, we'd catch glimpses of our pursuers pacing us through the forest. They couldn't approach the water directly, but they weren't giving up. Dawn found us still walking, though Sarah had to be carried completely now. She was showing signs of severe hypothermia, and I knew we didn't have much time left. The creatures had fallen behind as the sun rose, but I could still sense them out there, waiting for us to make a mistake. Finally, we reached a place where the stream passed under a ranger station access road. A Park Service truck was parked nearby, and I could see a ranger in the distance checking something on a trail marker. "Help!" I screamed, waving frantically. "We need help!" Ranger Powell, according to his name tag, was a weathered man in his 50s who took one look at our condition and immediately called for a medical helicopter. While we waited for the medevac, he wrapped us in emergency blankets and gave us hot coffee from a thermos. "What happened to you folks?" he asked. "You look like you've seen hell itself." I opened my mouth to tell him about the creatures, about Marcus and Brian and the horror in the forest. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something that shouldn't exist? Who would believe us? "We got lost," I said finally. "2 of our friends. They fell into a ravine. We couldn't get them out." Emma stared at me but said nothing. Sarah was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, and we were airlifted to a hospital in Corbin. Sarah survived, though she lost 2 toes to frostbite and walked with a limp for the rest of her life. Emma and I were treated for exposure and released the next day. The official search for Marcus and Brian lasted 2 weeks. Rangers found our campsite at Hensley Settlement, along with their abandoned gear, but no trace of the men themselves. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons investigation, with the assumption that they'd gotten lost in the vast wilderness and died of exposure. Only Emma and I knew the truth. I quit my job a month later and moved to Phoenix, as far from those Kentucky mountains as I could get. Emma did the same, relocating to Seattle. We stayed in touch for a while but eventually stopped calling each other. The memories were too painful, and neither of us wanted to be reminded of what we'd seen. But sometimes, late at night, I'll get a phone call with no one on the other end. Just breathing. And occasionally, if I listen very carefully, a familiar voice whispering, "Jennifer. I found your new address, I remember. Working with you. I remember. Being your friend." Then the line goes dead, and I spend the rest of the night checking the locks on my doors and windows, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, something that wears the faces of the dead is still hunting for me. The thing that scares me most isn't the possibility that they might find me someday. It's the growing certainty that what we encountered in the Daniel Boone National Forest wasn't unique. Those mountains are vast and largely unexplored, full of places where ancient things still walk in the spaces between reality and nightmare. And sometimes when I see missing person reports on the news, hikers and campers who vanished without a trace in remote wilderness areas, I wonder if their friends received the same phone calls I do. I wonder if somewhere out there, other survivors are looking over their shoulders and jumping at shadows, knowing that the faces of their lost loved ones are being worn like masks by things that should not exist. The skinwalkers are still out there, still hunting, still wearing the skins of the missing and the dead. And someday, when I'm old and weak and can no longer run, I know they'll come for me. When that day comes, I just hope whoever finds my body doesn't look too closely at my face, because by then it might not be mine anymore,